10 minutes before they cut into my throat to remove a cancerous tumor, my husband sent me a text that stopped my heart. It read, "I want a divorce." I could not even cry. The surgical room was freezing, but the wedding ring on my finger felt like ice. The woman in the hospital bed next to me turned pale, pointed at the photo on my phone screen, and whispered the 4 words that shattered my entire reality. "That is my fiancé." And then she showed me exactly why he was in such a rush to leave me to die. My name is Clara Jenkins. I am 31 years old and a meticulous bookkeeper at a local logistics firm here in the suburbs of Seattle. For my entire adult life, numbers have been my sanctuary. I balance ledgers, I track expenses, and I ensure that every single penny is exactly where it is supposed to be. Numbers do not lie. Numbers do not manipulate you. They tell a clear, undeniable story of deposits and withdrawals of investments and returns. But sitting in that freezing pre-operative room at Seattle General Hospital, none of my numbers could save me. The steady, relentless beep of the heart monitor echoed off the sterile white walls, measuring a pulse that was already running entirely too fast. The intravenous needle taped aggressively to the back of my hand felt like a dull, throbbing ache that shot all the way up my arm. I was exactly 10 minutes away from a high-risk surgery to remove my thyroid. The cancer had spread faster than the doctors had initially anticipated. It was terrifying. You never really know how incredibly cold a hospital gown is until you are shivering underneath one, waiting to be put to sleep, wondering if you will actually wake up. As I lay there staring up at the harsh fluorescent lights, I was doing what I always did to calm my nerves. I was thinking about my husband, Trent. Trent was 34 years old, a charismatic real estate broker with a smile that could sell a swamp to a fisherman. When we met 5 years ago, he was drowning in debt. His business was failing, his credit was ruined, and he was on the verge of declaring personal bankruptcy. I loved him, so I stepped in. I took over his finances. I spent the last 5 years working double shifts at the logistics firm, taking on freelance tax clients on the weekends, crunching numbers, until my eyes literally blurred, and eating cheap canned soup just to pay off his massive business loans. I even took out a home equity line of credit on the small house I had purchased before we got married, just to keep his real estate agency afloat. I drove a 10-year-old sedan with a rattling engine so he could lease a luxury car that matched his corporate image. I sacrificed every vacation, every new dress, every small comfort because I believed in him. I trusted him implicitly. I thought that is what marriage is supposed to be. A true partnership, a team. You build together, you struggle together, and eventually you succeed together. But as I faced the most terrifying moment of my life, my team consisted of just me. Trent was not sitting in the uncomfortable plastic guest chair beside my hospital bed. He was not holding my cold hand. He had kissed my forehead that morning in our kitchen, put on his best tailored charcoal suit, sprayed on the expensive cologne I had bought him for our anniversary, and told me he had a crucial closing downtown. He held my face in his hands and looked at me with deep, concerned eyes. He said the commission from this massive commercial real estate deal was the only way we could afford the mounting pile of medical bills my cancer treatments were racking up. I told him I understood. I told him I loved him. I told him to go close the deal and secure our future. I was so blindly loyal that I actually felt guilty for taking up his time with my illness. I convinced myself that his absence was an act of profound love and sacrifice. I laid in that hospital bed feeling proud of how hard my husband was working to save my life. The large wall clock above the nurse station ticked loudly. 10 minutes until the surgeon would come through those double doors to wheel me away. Suddenly, the phone resting on my lap vibrated. A text message. Notification illuminated the screen, casting a soft blue glow over the stark white hospital sheets. I smiled a genuine relieved smile, thinking it was Trent sending me a quick word of encouragement before I went under anesthesia. I picked up the phone with shaking hands. But it was not a message of love. It was a message of execution. I stared at the harsh black letters on the glowing screen. I want a divorce. I will have my lawyer send the papers next week. I read the words once, then twice, then a third time. My brain, the exact same brain that could reconcile $1 million corporate ledger in a single afternoon, completely short-circuited. Divorce. Now. 10 minutes before surgery, I might not survive. The sheer, unadulterated cruelty of it was suffocating. I could not breathe. My chest tightened so violently that the heart monitor beside me began to beep frantically, a high-pitched, rapid alarm warning the nurses that my heart rate was spiking to dangerous levels. I tried to type a response. I tried to ask him why, to beg him to tell me this was a cruel joke, but my fingers were trembling too violently. My grip completely failed. The phone slipped from my sweaty hands and landed flat on the crisp white hospital blanket covering my legs. The screen remained lit brightly, displaying my lock screen wallpaper. It was our wedding photo. Trent and I standing under a massive oak tree, looking insanely happy, promising to love each other through sickness and in health. A sharp, sudden gasp from the bed next to mine snapped me out of my spiraling panic. I turned my head slowly, fighting through the fog of absolute terror. The privacy curtain between the beds had been pulled back slightly by a nurse checking vitals earlier. The patient beside me was a young woman named Chloe. She was 28 years old, waiting for a complex reconstructive knee surgery after a bad skiing accident. We had exchanged polite, nervous smiles earlier that morning. She had even joked about how she needed to heal quickly because she was planning a destination wedding next spring. Now Chloe was sitting bolt upright, completely ignoring the heavy medical brace on her leg. All the color had drained from her face. She looked like she had just seen a ghost. She was staring wide-eyed at my phone screen, which was still brightly displaying my wedding photo. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice cracking barely more than a raspy whisper. I honestly thought she was reacting to my heart monitor alarm going off. I thought my panic attack was scaring her. But Chloe did not look at the monitor. She did not look at the nurses rushing past the doorway. She did not even look at me. Her eyes were absolutely transfixed on the photo of Trent. Her hands began to shake just as badly as mine had. She raised a trembling finger and pointed directly at my husband's smiling face on my screen. I felt a thick, heavy knot form in my stomach, a cold, dreadful knot that had absolutely nothing to do with the freezing hospital air or the impending cancer surgery. "Where did you get that picture?" Chloe asked, her voice tight with a panic I did not understand. I swallowed hard, my throat completely dry. "What do you mean?" I asked her. "That is my husband, Trent. We have been married for 5 years. Chloe let out a sound that was half sob, half choke. She covered her mouth with both of her hands, tears instantly welling up in her wide eyes. She slowly reached over to her own bedside table, grabbing her phone with unsteady hands. She unlocked her screen and held her phone out toward me across the small gap between our hospital beds. "Look," she whispered, her voice trembling with absolute horror. I leaned over as far as my IV line would allow. The screen on her phone showed a photograph of Trent. He was wearing the exact same tailored charcoal suit he had put on this morning in our bedroom, the suit he wore to go secure our financial future. He was sitting at a high-end brunch restaurant holding a mimosa glass up to the camera, smiling that exact same charismatic smile that had charmed me 5 years ago. The sun was shining on his face. The caption written across the top of the photo read, "Celebrating our future together." I stared at it, my mind racing desperately, trying to compute a mathematical equation that simply did not make any sense. He was supposed to be at a commercial real estate closing. He was supposed to be saving us. Instead, he was drinking mimosas while I was preparing to have my throat cut open. "Who are you?" I asked her, my voice barely audible over the hum of the medical machinery in the room. Chloe looked me dead in the eyes, a single tear finally spilling over her cheek and running down her face. "He is not just your husband," she said. "That is my fiancé." I stared at Chloe. The words she just spoke hung in the freezing air of the hospital room. "That is my fiancé." My brain could not process the sentence. I looked from her tear-streaked face back to the glowing screen of her phone. Trent was smiling. The man I had kissed goodbye just hours ago was holding a mimosa, celebrating his future, with a woman sitting 3 feet away from me. I asked Chloe to show me the messages. My voice did not sound like my own. It sounded hollow, like an echo from a very deep well. Chloe's hands shook violently as she unlocked her phone and handed it to me. She was terrified. She was waiting for a knee surgery, vulnerable and scared, and now she was discovering that the man she loved was a complete fabrication. I took the phone. The screen was bright and the text messages between them stretched back for over a year. 365 days of good morning texts, of sweet dreams, of fake business trips that were actually romantic getaways. But the betrayal of his infidelity was not the worst part. The worst part was the narrative he had spun to explain my existence. I scrolled up my eyes, scanning the harsh black text against the white background. I saw my own name. I saw the way my husband talked about me to this stranger. Trent had told Chloe that he was a wealthy real estate developer. He told her that he was trapped in a tragic, heartbreaking situation. He claimed that his wife, me, was terminally ill. According to the messages I was reading, I had been battling stage 4 cancer for years. He painted himself as the devoted, suffering husband, waiting by my bedside, spending his vast fortune on my medical care, watching the love of his life slowly slip away. He told her that my passing was imminent. He told her that his doctors had given me only weeks to live. He had even sent her a message just 2 days ago. It read, "The end is very near, Chloe. My wife is fading fast. It is a tragedy, but I am finding my strength in you. I cannot wait to start our new life together once this dark chapter is finally over." I read the words again. This dark chapter. I was the dark chapter. I was the obstacle standing between him and his new life. He was not just cheating on me. He was actively wishing for my death. He had orchestrated this entire fantasy where I died a tragic death, leaving him a wealthy, grieving widower free to marry his beautiful young bride. I handed the phone back to Chloe. My hands were perfectly still now. The panic had completely evaporated. In its place, a cold, calculated numbness washed over me. Chloe was weeping openly now. She kept apologizing, telling me she had absolutely no idea, swearing that he told her we had been separated for years before I got sick. She said he promised her a lavish wedding in Italy next spring. She wanted to show me proof that she was not making this up. She wiped her eyes and opened a different application on her phone. It was a joint banking app, a shared wedding fund they had set up to pay for the venue, the caterers, and the flights to Europe. She turned the screen toward me. "Look at this," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He deposited $150,000 into our wedding account just last week. He told me it was a bonus from a massive commercial real estate closing. He said it was the start of our forever." I looked at the glowing numbers on the screen. $150,000. As a bookkeeper, I spend 40 hours a week analyzing bank statements, reconciling accounts, and tracking down missing funds. Numbers are my first language. I do not just look at the total balance. I look at the transaction details. I look at the routing codes. I leaned closer to Chloe's screen, my eyes scanning the fine print of the wire transfer receipt displayed in the app. My heart stopped beating. The blood in my veins turned to ice water. I recognized the routing number of the originating bank. I recognized the last 4 digits of the originating account. It was not a corporate account from his real estate brokerage. It was a personal account. Specifically, it was the account linked to the home equity line of credit on my house. Before I ever met Trent, I was a 24-year-old woman working 2 jobs, saving every single penny to buy a small 3-bedroom house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. That house was my pride and joy. It was the physical proof of my independence and my hard work. When Trent and I got married, he convinced me to add his name to the deed, claiming it was for tax purposes and to build our joint credit. I trusted him. I loved him. I thought we were building a life together. But looking at Chloe's phone, I realized the horrifying truth. Trent had completely drained the equity out of my home. He had taken out a massive loan against the house I worked so hard to buy, a house I had paid the mortgage on entirely by myself because his business was always struggling. He stole $150,000 of my money to fund his destination wedding with another woman. He had committed felony fraud, forging my signature on the loan documents because I never authorized a withdrawal of that magnitude. He had taken everything. My health, my youth, my money, and my home. I leaned back against the thin hospital pillow. The ceiling tiles above me seemed to blur and spin. Everything finally made sense. The pieces of the puzzle clicked together with devastating clarity. My thyroid cancer diagnosis had been terrifying. The doctors told me that while the tumor was concerning thyroid cancer is generally highly treatable, they recommended a standard minimally invasive procedure. But Trent had intervened. He had done his own research. He had found a different surgeon, a doctor known for aggressive high-risk approaches. Trent had insisted that we go with the more radical surgery. He argued with my primary care physician. He held my hand and cried, telling me he loved me too much to take any chances with a conservative approach. He convinced me that this high-risk surgery was the absolute only way to guarantee the cancer would not return. He pushed for it. He demanded it. He rushed the scheduling, moving the surgery date up by 3 full weeks. He did not rush the surgery to save my life. He rushed it hoping I would die on the operating table. If I died during this high-risk procedure, his problems would instantly vanish. He would play the role of the tragic grieving widower. He would collect the massive life insurance policy he had insisted we buy last year. He would keep the $150,000 he stole from my home equity. He would marry Chloe in Italy, funded entirely by my life savings and my death. And he sent that divorce text 10 minutes before my surgery as a sick backup plan. If I somehow survived the operation, the stress and heartbreak of receiving a divorce text right before going under anesthesia might just push my already weakened body over the edge. Or at the very least, it would establish that we were officially separating, giving him a legal head start on dividing the assets he had already stolen. He was a predator, a calculated, cold-blooded monster wearing the tailored suit of a loving husband. He had drained my bank accounts, and now he was waiting for me to die so he could cash in the final ticket. The heavy double doors of the preoperative room swung open. 2 nurses in blue scrubs walked in, pushing a rolling medical cart. They checked my chart, verified the wristband on my arm, and offered me warm, sympathetic smiles. "All right, Clara," the older nurse said gently. "It is time. We are going to take you down the hall to the operating room now. The anesthesiologist is waiting. Are you ready?" Chloe looked at me from the next bed, her face pale, tears streaming down her cheeks. She was holding her phone tightly against her chest. She did not say a word, but her eyes held a silent apology, a shared horror at the monster we had both inadvertently let into our lives. I looked back at her and gave her a single slow nod, an unspoken promise between 2 women who had been played for fools. "I am ready," I told the nurse. My voice was no longer shaking. The fear that had paralyzed me just 15 minutes ago was completely gone. The tears had dried up. The panic had vanished. I felt a surge of adrenaline so powerful it completely muted the throbbing pain of the intravenous needle in my hand. The nurses unlocked the wheels of my hospital bed and began to push me out of the room. We rolled down the long, brightly lit corridor. The fluorescent lights passed overhead in a steady, rhythmic pattern. The squeak of the wheels on the polished linoleum floor echoed in the quiet hallway. I stared up at the ceiling, my mind working faster than it ever had before. I was a bookkeeper. I knew how to follow a paper trail. I knew how to find hidden assets. I knew how to document fraud. Trent thought I was just a naive, hard-working wife who would quietly accept her fate. He thought I would either die on this table or wake up too broken and devastated to fight back. He thought he had outsmarted me. But he had made a fatal miscalculation. He had left a trail of numbers, and numbers never lie. The surgical room was blindingly bright. The medical team surrounded me, moving with practiced efficiency. The anesthesiologist stood near my head, holding a clear plastic mask. He leaned over and spoke in a calm, soothing voice. "I am going to place this mask over your face now, Clara. I just want you to take deep, slow breaths. Count backward from 10. You will be asleep before you reach 7. He placed the mask over my nose and mouth. The sweet, sterile smell of the anesthesia gas filled my lungs. I took a deep breath. 10. I thought about the $150,000 stolen from my home. 9. I thought about the wedding in Italy he planned to pay for with my money. 8. I thought about the text message sitting on my phone, the cowardly dismissal of 5 years of marriage. 7. I thought about the fact that he was currently sitting in a restaurant drinking a mimosa, waiting for a phone call telling him his wife had tragically passed away during surgery. My vision began to blur. The bright lights above me started to fade into a soft, hazy darkness. The voices of the surgical team grew distant and muffled. But as the anesthesia pulled me under, pulling me down into the heavy, quiet blackness, one singular burning thought anchored my mind. A thought so fierce it felt like a vow carved directly into my soul. I am not going to die today. I am going to survive this surgery. I am going to wake up. And when I do, I am going to destroy him. I am going to take back every single thing he stole from me, and I am going to burn his entire world to the ground. If you have ever had your heart broken by the person who swore to protect you, type "I will survive" in the comments, and please hit that like button to hear how I turned the tables on him. Waking up from a high-risk thyroid surgery feels like swallowing crushed glass. The heavy, suffocating weight of the anesthesia slowly lifted, leaving behind a sharp, slicing pain at the front of my neck. My eyes fluttered open to the harsh glare of fluorescent hospital lights. I tried to swallow, but my throat completely seized. I raised a heavy, trembling hand to my neck and felt thick layers of gauze and medical tape. The steady beep of the heart monitor next to me was the only sound in the room. A nurse noticed I was awake and rushed over, offering me a small cup of ice chips and a warm, reassuring smile. She told me the surgery was a complete success. The surgeon had removed the entire tumor. I was going to live. I took a tiny piece of ice into my dry mouth and let it melt. I was going to live. The doctors had done their job. Now I had to do mine. The memory of what happened right before I went under anesthesia hit me like a physical blow. The text message from my husband demanding a divorce. The pale, terrified face of Chloe in the bed next to me. The photograph of Trent drinking a mimosa celebrating his future with a woman he had lied to for an entire year. The joint bank account displaying $150,000 of my stolen money. My pulse began to race again, but this time it was not out of fear or panic. It was pure, unadulterated rage. A cold, calculated fury settled deep into my bones. I laid there in the quiet recovery room, staring at the ceiling, waiting. I knew Trent would have to show up eventually. He had to play the role of the concerned husband for the hospital staff, at least for a few minutes. 2 hours later, the heavy wooden door to my private recovery room slowly pushed open. Trent walked in. He was still wearing the same tailored charcoal suit he had put on that morning. He looked impeccable. Not a single hair was out of place. He did not look like a man whose wife had just survived a major cancer surgery. He did not look relieved. If anything, as his eyes met mine, I saw a brief, unmistakable flash of profound disappointment cross his face. He had really hoped I would not wake up. He had gambled our entire future on my death, and he had lost. He stopped at the foot of my hospital bed, deliberately keeping a physical distance between us. He did not reach for my hand. He did not ask how I was feeling or what the surgeon had said. He just stood there looking at me with a perfectly crafted expression of weary martyrdom. "Clara," he said, his voice dropping into that smooth, condescending tone he always used when he wanted to control a situation. "I see you made it through." I could not speak. The bandages around my throat made it impossible to form words without agonizing pain, but even if I could talk, I would not have given him the satisfaction. I just looked at him, letting my silence force him to fill the quiet room with his lies. "I know you saw my text message before you went into the operating room." He continued, shifting his weight from one expensive leather shoe to the other. "I know the timing was not ideal. But you have to understand my position, Clara. The last 5 years have been incredibly difficult for me. Your illness, the constant doctor appointments, the stress of carrying the financial burden for this household. It has completely drained me. I have lost myself trying to take care of you." I stared at him, my face a blank canvas. He was actually standing in my hospital room mere hours after my throat was sliced open, blaming his infidelity on my cancer. He was claiming he carried the financial burden, completely ignoring the fact that I had worked double shifts for years to pay off his massive business loans. He was rewriting our entire history right in front of my face to justify his betrayal. "I need space," Trent said, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair to look appropriately distressed. "I need time to find out who I am again. I cannot be the husband you need right now. I signed a short-term lease on an apartment across town. I'm going to pack up a few of my things tonight while you are recovering here. I think it is best if we do not communicate for a while. You need to focus on healing and I need to focus on my mental health." He was incredibly good at this. If I had not seen Chloe's phone, if I had not read his text messages, referring to me as a terminal burden who was about to leave him a wealthy widower, I might have actually believed his performance. I might have cried and begged him to stay. I might have blamed myself for pushing him away. That is what gaslighting does to you. It makes you question your own reality until you accept the version of the truth your abuser hands you. But I knew the truth now. I knew he was not moving into a short-term apartment to find himself. He was going to spend the weekend with his fiancé, planning a lavish destination wedding in Italy funded by my stolen money. I knew that to catch a predator, you have to play dead. I needed him to believe that he had completely broken me. I needed him to walk out of this hospital feeling absolutely victorious, confident that I was too weak and devastated to ever look into our finances. I forced my eyes to well up with tears. It was not hard to do. The physical pain in my neck was excruciating. I let a single tear roll down my cheek. I gave him a slow, defeated nod. I reached over to the small bedside table, grabbed a black marker and a small whiteboard the nurses had left for me to communicate, and with a shaky hand, I wrote a single word. "Okay." Trent looked at the whiteboard and let out a heavy sigh of relief. The tension visibly left his shoulders. He had gotten away with it. He dropped a pitiful plastic-wrapped bouquet of cheap gas station carnations onto the rolling tray table at the end of my bed. "I will have my lawyer draw up the initial paperwork next week," he said, turning toward the door. "We can keep this simple, Clara. Do not make this harder than it needs to be. Take care of yourself." He did not look back as he walked out of the room. The heavy door clicked shut behind him, sealing me in the quiet, sterile space. The moment the latch clicked, the defeated, weeping wife vanished. I wiped the tear from my cheek with the back of my hand. I sat up slightly, ignoring the sharp pull of the stitches in my neck. I reached for my personal belongings bag sitting on the chair next to my bed and pulled out my cell phone. My fingers flew across the screen as I opened my text messages. I sent a single text to the number Chloe had given me before they wheeled me away. He just left. He told me he needs space for his mental health. Chloe replied less than 30 seconds later. He just texted me. He said the closing was brutal and the clients were exhausting, but he is finally on his way to my apartment to celebrate our future. I read her message and felt a cold, grim smile pull at the corners of my mouth. He was walking right into the trap, completely unaware that the two women he was playing against each other were now communicating in real time. I pressed the call button pinned to my hospital gown. A young nurse popped her head into the room a minute later. I pointed to the heavy leather laptop bag sitting on the bottom shelf of the bedside cart. The nurse smiled sympathetically, walked over, and handed the bag to me. I nodded my thanks as she left the room. I unzipped the bag and pulled out my laptop. Balancing it on my knees over the hospital blankets, I carefully maneuvered around the IV line taped to my left hand. I powered the machine on and connected to the hospital guest network. The connection was painfully slow, but I did not care. I had all the time in the world. As a professional bookkeeper, my entire career is built on the absolute certainty that money leaves a trail. People can lie. People can create elaborate stories. People can fake tears in a hospital room. But bank routing numbers, notary stamps, and county property records do not lie. They form a permanent, undeniable history of exactly who did what and when. Trent had told Chloe that the $150,000 in their joint wedding fund came from a commercial real estate closing. But I knew that routing number. I knew it was tied to the home equity line of credit attached to my house. The house I bought when I was 24 years old. The house whose deed I foolishly added his name to 5 years ago because he convinced me it was the right thing to do for a married couple. I opened my web browser and navigated directly to the King County Recorder's Office Public Records portal. The screen loaded slowly, displaying the familiar search fields I used constantly in my line of work to verify client assets. I typed in my own address. I entered my legal name and Trent's legal name. I hit the search button. The system processed the request and generated a list of recorded documents tied to our property parcel number. I scanned the list. The original warranty deed from when I bought the house 7 years ago. The quitclaim deed from 5 years ago when I added Trent to the title. And then at the very top of the list, a brand new document recorded exactly 3 weeks ago. The document type was listed as a deed of trust. The filing description indicated a home equity line of credit. My heart pounded a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs as I clicked on the PDF icon to view the scanned images of the actual recorded document. The first page loaded on my screen. It was a standard loan agreement from a major national bank. The principal amount listed in bold black ink was exactly $150,000. I stared at that number, $150,000, the exact amount sitting in Chloe's joint wedding fund. Trent had leveraged the entire remaining equity of my house. He had essentially stolen the roof over my head to pay for his new life. But taking out a loan against a jointly owned property requires the signatures of both property owners. The bank would never release $150,000 without both of us signing the loan documents in front of a licensed notary public. And I had never signed anything. I had never sat in a bank office. I had never seen these papers in my entire life. I scrolled rapidly through the 30-page PDF document, bypassing the standard legal boilerplate language, moving directly toward the final pages. I needed to see the signature block. I needed to see exactly how he pulled this off. The final page loaded. I zoomed in on the screen. There on the line designated for the primary borrower was Trent's signature, bold, arrogant, and authentic. And directly below it on the line designated for the CO borrower was my name, Clara Jenkins Sterling. I stared at the blue ink on the scanned page. It was a spectacular forgery. The slant of the letters, the loop of the J, the sharp cross of the T. It looked exactly like my signature. If I did not know with absolute certainty that I had never signed this document, I might have believed it was real. Trent had clearly spent hours practicing my handwriting, studying old tax returns and joint checks until he could replicate my signature flawlessly. I shifted my gaze to the bottom right corner of the page. Beside the forged signatures was a bright, perfectly round notary stamp. The notary public's signature was scrawled across the seal, attesting under penalty of perjury that both Trent and Clara Sterling had personally appeared before him, produced valid state-issued identification, and signed this document freely and voluntarily. Trent had not just forged my signature. He had found a corrupt notary public willing to break the law and falsify government documents to push this loan through the system. I leaned back against the hospital pillows, my mind racing through the legal implications of what I was looking at on my screen. This was no longer just a messy divorce. This was no longer just a husband cheating on his sick wife. This was a calculated, multi-layered financial crime. By forging my name on a bank loan document and illegally extracting $150,000 from the equity of my home, Trent had committed felony forgery. By electronically moving those stolen funds into a joint account with Chloe across state lines to pay for an international wedding venue, he had committed federal wire fraud. And by presenting a falsified notary seal to the county recorder's office, he had committed a severe property crime. Trent thought he was a real estate genius. He thought he could manipulate the system, steal my life savings, and walk away clean while I battled cancer. He thought I was nothing more than a naive, exhausted woman who would just sign whatever divorce papers he shoved in front of me because I was too weak to fight. He was completely wrong. I pressed the print screen button on my laptop, saving a high-resolution copy of the forged deed of trust to my secure cloud drive. I downloaded the entire PDF file and emailed it to a private encrypted email address I had set up years ago for my bookkeeping business. I was securing the evidence. I was building the chain of custody. I closed my laptop and set it back on the rolling tray table. The pain in my neck was throbbing, a constant reminder of how close I had come to dying today. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the clarity taking shape in my mind. Trent had crossed a line that you simply cannot uncross. He had committed multiple felonies to fund a lavish new life with a woman he had also completely deceived. He had tried to discard me in the most cruel, humiliating way possible, timing his divorce demand to coincide with a major surgery, hoping the stress would kill me. I looked at the cheap gas station flowers he had left on my table. They were already beginning to wilt under the harsh hospital lights. I reached over, picked up the plastic-wrapped bouquet, and dropped it directly into the trash can beside my bed. I was not going to play the victim. I was not going to cry over a man who viewed me as nothing more than a financial stepping stone. I was going to use my professional skills to dismantle his entire life piece by piece. I was going to gather every shred of evidence, every forged document, every hidden account, and I was going to hand it all over to the most ruthless attorney I could find. Trent thought he had played the ultimate game of deception, but he had forgotten one crucial detail. You should never, ever commit financial fraud against a professional bookkeeper. I was moved into a private recovery room on the 4th floor of the hospital shortly after noon. The heavy anesthesia was slowly wearing off, leaving me hyper-aware of the physical trauma my body had just endured. A thick bandage wrapped tightly around my neck, securing the incision where the surgeon had removed my thyroid. Every time I swallowed, a sharp burning pain radiated down my throat, but the physical agony was nothing compared to the absolute clarity settling into my mind. I lay perfectly still against the crisp hospital sheets, staring out the small window at the gray Seattle sky. I had the forged home equity document safely downloaded and backed up. I knew Trent was planning to marry a woman named Chloe in Italy using my stolen money. I knew he was wishing for my death. I thought I had uncovered the absolute bottom of his betrayal. I was wrong. The nightmare was only just beginning to unfold. The heavy wooden door of my recovery room did not open gently. It banged open with such sudden violence that I actually jumped, sending a shockwave of pain through my fresh stitches. I turned my head slowly, wincing as the muscles in my neck pulled tight. Standing in the doorway was Trent's older sister, Sarah. Sarah was 36 years old, a wealthy, judgmental suburbanite who lived in an immaculately decorated house in Bellevue. She drove a brand new white Range Rover, spent her afternoons at an exclusive tennis club, and had never worked a day since marrying a senior vice president of a tech firm. From the very first day Trent introduced us, Sarah had made it abundantly clear that she despised me. She looked down on my working-class background. She thought my job as a bookkeeper was painfully blue-collar. She constantly made passive-aggressive comments about my clothes, my 10-year-old car, and my lack of a trust fund. To Sarah, I was nothing more than a peasant who had somehow manipulated her charming, successful brother into marriage. She marched into my hospital room, her designer heels clicking sharply against the linoleum floor. She wore a tailored beige trench coat over a crisp white blouse, and her blonde hair was perfectly styled. She did not look at me with the sympathy you would expect someone to show a family member who just survived cancer surgery. She looked at me with a mixture of absolute disgust and triumphant vindication. She stopped at the foot of my bed, gripping her expensive leather handbag with both hands. "I cannot believe you have the nerve to just lay there and play the victim," she snapped. Her voice was sharp and loud, completely ignoring the quiet atmosphere of a hospital recovery wing. I stared at her, genuinely confused. My throat was far too swollen to speak normally, so I just looked at her, my eyebrows drawing together in silent question. "Do not look at me like that, Clara. Do not play dumb with me," Sarah continued, taking a step closer to the bed. Her eyes were narrowed with fury. "Trent came to my house this morning. He was completely broken. He was sobbing in my kitchen. He told me everything. He told me what you have been doing behind his back for the last year." I felt a cold prickle of dread crawl up my spine. What could Trent have possibly told her? I tried to speak, forcing a raspy, painful croak past my vocal cords. "What are you talking about?" I whispered. "Oh, please save the innocent act," Sarah scoffed, rolling her eyes dramatically. "We all know the truth now. Trent finally confessed how miserable you have made him. He told me about the affair, Clara. He told me how he caught you sending messages to another man." My heart skipped a beat. An affair. I had spent the last 5 years working double shifts to pay off his debts, coming home exhausted and falling asleep on the couch with my laptop open. I barely had time to eat a proper meal, let alone carry on a secret romance. Sarah did not stop. She was building momentum, feeding on her own righteous indignation. "And that is not even the worst part," she hissed, leaning over the footboard of my bed. "He told me how you have been secretly draining your joint savings accounts. He said you took over $50,000 out of your emergency fund and gave it to this other man. My brother has been working himself to the bone, stressed out of his mind, trying to pay your medical bills, and you have been stealing from him to fund your little secret life." I laid there completely paralyzed by the sheer, staggering magnitude of his lies. Trent had not just stolen $150,000 from my home equity. He had not just planned a secret wedding with another woman. He had preemptively assassinated my character to his entire family. He knew that when he filed for divorce, questions would be asked. He knew the sudden separation would look terrible for him, abandoning his wife while she was battling cancer. So he flipped the narrative entirely. He painted himself as the tragic, betrayed husband and painted me as the cruel, cheating, thieving wife. "He told me you demanded a divorce this morning," Sarah said, her voice dripping with venom. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest. "He said you waited until 10 minutes before your surgery to text him that you wanted out. You purposely timed it to cause him maximum emotional damage while he was already terrified for your life. You are a monster, Clara. You are a sick, manipulative monster, and I am so incredibly glad he is finally leaving you." My first instinct was visceral and completely human. I wanted to scream. I wanted to rip the bandages off my throat, jump out of that hospital bed, and scream the truth right into her perfectly made-up face. I wanted to tell her about Chloe. I wanted to tell her about the forged deed of trust. I wanted to pull up the county property records and show her exactly who the real thief in the family was. I wanted to defend myself against these vile, disgusting accusations. I opened my mouth to argue back, to fight for my dignity. But as I drew in a breath, a sharp, blinding pain shot through my vocal cords. I could not scream. I could barely even whisper. The physical limitation of my surgery forced me into silence. And in that forced silence, the analytical professional part of my brain took over. I am a bookkeeper. I deal in facts, not emotions. I know that arguing with an angry, irrational person produces absolutely zero results. Sarah was Trent's flying monkey. She was completely brainwashed by his narrative. Nothing I said to her right now would change her mind. She would just go back and report my reactions to him. But if I let her talk, if I let her feel powerful and arrogant, she might just reveal something useful. I slowly shifted my left hand under the thin hospital blanket. My cell phone was resting near my hip. Without breaking eye contact with Sarah, I used my thumb to blindly press the side button, waking the screen. I swiped down, memorized the location of the voice memo application from years of using it to record accounting notes, and tapped the center of the screen. I felt the slight haptic vibration confirming the recording had started. I took a shaky breath and completely changed my demeanor. I let my shoulders slump against the pillows. I relaxed my facial muscles. I let the tears that were already burning in my eyes from the physical pain spill over my eyelashes and run down my cheeks. I let out a weak, pathetic, trembling sob. I played the exact role Sarah had walked into this room expecting to see. I played the broken, guilty wife who had finally been caught. "Please, Sarah," I whispered, making my voice sound as fragile and devastated as humanly possible. "Please, I do not know what he told you. I have nothing. I am so scared." The sight of my tears acted like premium fuel for Sarah's arrogance. Bullies absolutely love a weak target. She uncrossed her arms and stood a little taller, a smug, satisfied smile spreading across her face. She felt victorious. She felt like she had single-handedly put the working-class trash exactly where she belonged. "You should be scared," Sarah said, her voice dripping with condescending pity. "Did you honestly think you could outsmart my brother? Did you think you could steal from a real estate broker and get away with it? You are just a glorified calculator, Clara. You do not understand how real money works." I let out another soft whimper, encouraging her to keep talking. "I need my house," I sobbed weakly. "Please tell him I just want to keep my house." Sarah laughed. It was a cold, harsh sound that echoed in the small room. "Your house," she mocked. "You mean the house you bought before you even met him, the little starter home you are so proud of. Trent does not care about your pathetic little house, Clara. He does not need it. You thought you could ruin him financially, but you are entirely wrong. Trent is 10 steps ahead of you, Ed." My heart began to race. I kept my face buried slightly in my shoulder, hiding my changing expression, but my ears were highly attuned to every single syllable coming out of her mouth. "He knew you were trying to drain the accounts." Sarah continued, leaning closer, eager to rub my face in my apparent defeat. "That is why he has been moving his real wealth where you can never touch it. He has been planning his financial independence from you for months." I forced myself to look up at her, widening my eyes in feigned shock. "What real wealth?" I whispered hoarsely. Sarah smiled proudly, completely oblivious to the fact that she was currently destroying her brother's master plan. "You really have no idea, do you?" she bragged. "You think he just works at that little suburban brokerage selling 3-bedroom houses? Trent is building an empire. He just closed on 2 massive commercial lots in the Bellevue Tech District last month under a private holding company. He secured an offshore trust to protect his new assets. He has been funneling his massive commissions into private investments for the last 6 months to make sure a gold digger like you could never get her hands on it in a divorce." I stared at her, keeping the terrified expression frozen on my face while my mind exploded with a million terrifying and glorious calculations. 2 massive commercial lots in the Bellevue Tech District, a private holding company, an offshore trust. Trent did not just forge a home equity line of credit to steal $150,000 for a destination wedding in Italy. That money was just the tip of the iceberg. It was pocket change compared to what Sarah was describing. Commercial lots in Bellevue cost millions of dollars. An ordinary real estate broker struggling with business debt does not magically acquire commercial real estate under a private LLC. Trent was embezzling. He was hiding massive amounts of money. He was likely siphoning funds from his own clients, laundering the money through shell companies, and setting up offshore trusts to hide the assets from the government and from me. The $150,000 he pulled from my house was probably just seed money or a bridge loan to cover his tracks while he moved larger sums around. He is going to leave you with absolutely nothing, Clara. Sarah concluded, stepping back and smoothing the front of her trench coat. The family lawyer is already drawing up the papers. He is going to make sure you walk away with the clothes on your back. You can keep your little house. He has bigger things waiting for him. I hope this cancer gives you plenty of time to sit alone and think about what a horrible, deceitful wife you have been. She gave me one final look of absolute contempt. She turned on, her designer heel marched across the room and walked out, letting the heavy hospital door slam shut behind her. The room fell dead silent. The only sound was the steady rhythmic beeping of my heart monitor. I waited for 10 full seconds to make sure she was truly gone. Then I reached under the hospital blanket and pulled out my cell phone. The red recording timer on the screen read 4 minutes and 12 seconds. I pressed the stop button. I saved the audio file with the title, Sarah Confession. I immediately uploaded the file to my secure cloud server, sending a backup copy directly to the private email address I used for my accounting business. I set the phone down on the bed. I reached up and carefully wiped the remaining fake tears from my cheeks. The physical pain in my throat was still there, a sharp burning reminder of the surgery, but it was entirely masked by the massive surge of adrenaline coursing through my veins. Trent thought he had backed me into a corner. He thought his cruel text message would break my spirit. He thought sending his vicious, wealthy sister to my hospital room to berate me would deliver the final crushing blow to my mental state. He wanted me to feel small, worthless, and defeated. But Trent was a narcissist, and narcissists always make the exact same mistake. They underestimate the quiet people. They assume that because someone is gentle, hardworking, and loyal, they are also stupid. Trent had forgotten who he married. He had forgotten that I spent my entire professional life auditing financial records, tracking down missing decimals, and exposing discrepancies. He had sent his sister into my room to gloat, and in doing so, he had accidentally handed a professional bookkeeper the exact map, the specific locations, and the operational structure of his hidden financial empire. I closed my eyes and took a deep, careful breath. The trap was no longer just about a forged signature on a home equity loan. It was about commercial real estate, private holding companies, and offshore trusts. I was going to find every single shell company. I was going to track every single wire transfer. I was going to uncover every stolen dollar. I did not just want my house back anymore. I wanted his absolute ruin. And thanks to Sarah, I finally knew exactly where to start digging. 4 days after the surgery, I was officially discharged from the hospital. The doctor gave me a strict list of instructions. He told me to go home, rest in a comfortable environment, and avoid any unnecessary stress while my throat healed. But I could not go back to my own house. I knew Trent was stopping by to pack his things, and the last thing I needed was a physical confrontation while my vocal cords were still heavily bandaged and burning with every breath. I needed him to believe his cruel plan was working perfectly. I needed him to think I was a broken, devastated woman hiding in the shadows, completely destroyed by his rejection. I rented a tiny, incredibly cheap apartment on a month-to-month lease in a noisy neighborhood just north of the city. The place smelled like old carpet and stale coffee. The wallpaper was peeling in the corners and the lone window looked out over a busy highway. It was a depressing, miserable little box, but it was the perfect stage for a tragedy. I sat on a sagging thrift store sofa with a cold ice pack pressed against my healing neck and pulled out my phone. I had to swallow my pride and play the victim. I drafted a message to Trent. I made sure to use words that would feed his massive, fragile ego. I wrote, "I am so sorry for everything, Trent. You are right. I have been difficult. I just want to rest and recover. I rented a small place across town so you can have the house to yourself while you figure things out. I will not bother you. Please just give me some time to heal." I hit send. It made me absolutely sick to my stomach to type those words to the monster who had stolen my money and wished for my death, but I knew exactly how he would react to total submission. 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed. His reply was exactly what I expected. "Take all the time you need, Clara. I am glad you are finally seeing reason. We will talk when you are better." He thought he had won. He thought I was crawling into a hole to fade away. He had absolutely no idea I was sitting in that cheap apartment building, a war room. The next afternoon, there was a soft, hesitant knock on the thin wooden door of my rental. I opened it to find Chloe standing in the hallway. She looked completely exhausted. She was leaning heavily on her metal crutches from her recent knee surgery, and her eyes were red and swollen from days of crying. We were two women battered by the exact same storm brought together by the sheer cruelty and boundless greed of one man. I stepped aside and helped her navigate into the small kitchen area. I made us both a hot cup of tea. For a long time, we just sat there at the tiny table in complete silence, processing the absolute nightmare our lives had become. Chloe finally took a shaky sip of her tea and looked at me. She told me Trent had come to her apartment the night before. He brought her expensive takeout, poured her a glass of expensive champagne, and talked for 2 straight hours about how incredibly relieved he was that the dark chapter of his marriage was finally ending. He told her I had basically surrendered without a fight. He told her our future in Italy was completely secured and they could start booking the vendors. Chloe started crying again as she told me this. She said she felt physically sick when he tried to touch her. She said she wanted to scream right in his face, throw the champagne at him, and call the police right then and there. I reached across the table and held her trembling hand. I told her we could not afford to act on pure emotion right now. Anger is loud and messy, but justice is quiet and incredibly precise. I told her exactly what his sister Sarah had revealed to me in the hospital recovery room. I told her about the offshore trusts and the commercial real estate properties he was secretly buying in the Bellevue Tech District. I explained that if we just confronted him now, he would immediately hire expensive defense lawyers and hide all the money before we could ever touch it. He would drag the legal process out for years until we were both bankrupt. We needed hard, undeniable evidence. We needed a verbal confession to match the paper trail. Chloe wiped her eyes with the back of her sleeve and her posture completely changed. The sadness vanished from her face and was instantly replaced by a fierce, cold determination. She looked at me and asked exactly what I needed her to do. I told her I needed her to be the ultimate inside woman. I needed her to play the role of the eager, naive fiancé who was just so incredibly excited about their wealthy future together. I needed her to ask specific questions about the money. I needed her to stroke his massive ego until he felt comfortable enough to brag about his brilliant financial maneuvers. I needed him to admit his crimes out loud. Chloe agreed without a single second of hesitation. She pulled her phone out of her pocket and showed me the voice recording application she had already downloaded. She promised me she would get everything on tape. 3 nights later, I sat alone in my dark living room waiting for her signal. The glowing screen of my laptop was the only light in the entire apartment. My stomach was tied in knots. At exactly 10:30, my phone finally lit up. It was a text message from Chloe. It just said, "Check your email." My heart hammered against my ribs as I opened my secure inbox. There was a large audio file attached to a blank message. I plugged in my headphones, took a very deep breath, and pressed play. The recording started with the ambient noise of a high-end seafood restaurant downtown. I could clearly hear the clinking of expensive crystal glasses and the soft murmur of wealthy background conversation. Then I heard Trent's voice. It was smooth, confident, and dripping with absolute arrogance. He was ordering a $200 bottle of wine for the table. I felt my stomach physically turn at the sound of him. Chloe played her part flawlessly. Her voice came through the audio, sounding breathless and completely adoring. She told him how incredibly proud she was of him. She told him she was so amazed by how quickly he had secured the funds for their dream wedding in Italy. Then she dropped the bait exactly how we had practiced. She asked him how he managed to get such a massive bonus from his real estate closing without his demanding terrible wife noticing the money was missing. There was a pause on the recording. I could hear him pouring the wine into her glass. Then he laughed. It was a dark, cruel sound that made my blood run absolutely cold. He told her it was not a bonus. He told her he had to be highly creative to protect their future together. Chloe acted perfectly confused and asked him what he meant by creative. And then Trent handed me the keys to his own destruction. He leaned in and lowered his voice, but the microphone on Chloe's phone picked up every single syllable. He bragged about how he had drained the equity from my house. He actually boasted about his superior intelligence. He told Chloe that I was a naive, exhausted bookkeeper who was too busy working double shifts to ever bother checking my own property records. But Chloe pushed him further. She sounded worried and asked him if the bank would ever find out. She asked him how he got past the strict signature requirements for a home equity line of credit. Trent laughed again, sounding completely invincible. He said it was the easiest thing in the world. He proudly confessed that he had spent 3 weeks practicing my signature until it was an absolute perfect match. He said he found a desperate notary public downtown who owed him a massive favor from a previous real estate deal. He told Chloe he slid the guy $5,000 in cash to stamp the legal documents without me being present. He called me weak. He called me stupid. He said I was so distracted by my terrifying cancer diagnosis that I would never even think to question the fake bank statements he had been printing out and leaving on my desk. He sat in that expensive restaurant drinking rare wine paid for by my sweat and tears, and completely admitted to felony forgery and federal wire fraud on tape. I sat in my cheap rental apartment listening to my husband laugh about stealing my life savings. I played the recording a second time, then a third time. I opened a blank document on my laptop and transcribed every single word he said. I logged the exact timestamps of his confessions. As a professional bookkeeper, I knew exactly how to build a rock-solid file. I matched his recorded words against the forged deed of trust I had downloaded from the county records office days earlier. I cross-referenced the dates he mentioned with the bank transfer records Chloe had provided. The puzzle was completely solved. Trent thought he had buried me alive. He thought I was sitting in this depressing apartment weeping over the loss of my marriage, too sick and broken to ever stand up to him. He had absolutely no idea that his discarded wife and his betrayed fiancé had just secured the exact evidence needed to send him to federal prison. I woke up the next morning before the sun even cleared the horizon. My neck was stiff and the pain medication had long since worn off, but my mind was sharper than it had been in years. I sat at the small wobbly kitchen table in my cheap rental apartment and opened my laptop. The audio recording of Trent bragging to Chloe was safely locked away in my cloud storage. Sarah's cruel confession about his hidden commercial real estate empire was secured right next to it. I had the blueprint of his deception. Now I just needed to tear the walls down. I spent the next 48 hours doing what I do best. I followed the numbers. Trent was arrogant, but he was incredibly sloppy. During the 5 years I spent working double shifts to pay off his business loans, I was the one who set up the initial accounting software for his real estate brokerage. He eventually locked me out of the primary administrative accounts when he claimed he was hiring a professional firm to handle things. But Trent was a creature of habit. He used the exact same password for everything. It was the name of his childhood dog followed by his birth year. He never bothered to change it on the shared digital drive we used to use for our household taxes. I logged into the back end of his brokerage system. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I bypassed the dashboard and went straight into the raw financial data. Sarah had mentioned massive commercial lots in the Bellevue Tech District. She had mentioned private holding companies. I pulled the master ledger and started filtering the transactions from the last 12 months. I was looking for large, unexplained outgoing wire transfers. It did not take me long to find them. The numbers painted a horrifying picture. Trent was not a real estate genius making massive commissions. He was running a shell game. He was moving money out of his clients' escrow accounts. In real estate, when a buyer makes an offer on a commercial property, they put down a massive sum of cash called earnest money. That money is supposed to sit untouched in a secure trust account until the deal closes. I stared at the screen as I tracked the flow of funds. Trent was taking that earnest money hundreds of thousands of dollars at a time and funneling it out to a private limited liability company registered in Delaware. He was using his clients' money to purchase those commercial lots in Bellevue. He was embezzling. It was a classic Ponzi scheme. He would steal the earnest money from a new client to replace the missing funds from an older client just before their closing date, keeping the excess to fund his lavish lifestyle and his secret plans with Chloe. He had stolen the equity out of my house to act as a slush fund, a financial buffer to keep his scheme afloat while he waited for his next massive payout. He was defrauding innocent families, small business owners, and corporate investors. He was a criminal. I sat back in my chair, the glow of the laptop screen reflecting in my eyes. I felt a wave of profound disgust wash over me. I had shared a bed with this man. I had cooked him dinner, washed his clothes, and sacrificed my own dreams to support his career. I thought I was helping a struggling entrepreneur build an honest business. Instead, I had been financing a professional con artist, but the financial fraud was only the beginning. The worst was yet to come. I needed more documentation. I needed the exact formation papers for his shell companies. I closed the accounting portal and opened the shared digital storage drive. This was a cloud account we originally opened years ago to store our scanned tax returns, copies of our passports, and our marriage certificate. Trent clearly still used it, thinking it was perfectly safe. He had created dozens of new folders over the past year. Most of them were labeled with boring, mundane titles like marketing expenses or tax prep. I clicked through them one by one, downloading every single file that looked even remotely suspicious. Then I found a folder simply labeled Insurance Policies. My cursor hovered over the yellow folder icon. A strange, heavy feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. My breathing slowed down. Something primal inside me, some deeply buried instinct of self-preservation, was screaming at me not to open it. But I clicked anyway. There were 3 files inside. The first 2 were standard policies for his luxury car and his business liability. The third file was named Clara Primary Life. I double-clicked the document. It was a 70-page policy from a major national insurance carrier. I scrolled past the terms and conditions, my eyes scanning the dense legal jargon until I reached the summary of benefits page. I stopped breathing. The air in the tiny apartment felt completely frozen. The death benefit payout was listed in bold black ink, $3 million. I stared at the number, $3 million. I did not have a $3 million life insurance policy. When we got married, we both took out modest policies for $250,000, just enough to cover the mortgage and funeral expenses if something terrible happened. But this document was different. I looked at the date of execution at the top of the page. The policy had been upgraded and finalized exactly 3 months ago. That was precisely 2 weeks after my doctor sat me down in a sterile office and told me I had a highly suspicious nodule on my thyroid that required immediate medical intervention. My hands began to shake violently. The pieces of the puzzle were no longer just falling into place. They were smashing together with terrifying, undeniable force. I remembered how Trent had reacted when I first told him about my cancer diagnosis. He had cried. He had held me. He had promised me we would fight it together. And then mere days later, he had quietly logged onto his computer, forged my electronic signature on a medical questionnaire, and tripled the payout on my life insurance policy. He had made himself the sole beneficiary. I kept scrolling through the digital folder. I found another document. It was an email chain between Trent and an aggressive surgical oncologist. I read the emails with growing horror. My primary care doctor had recommended a conservative surgery, a partial removal of the thyroid with minimal risk to my vocal cords and surrounding tissue. But Trent had reached out to this new surgeon independently. In the emails, Trent pleaded with the doctor. He wrote that his wife was absolutely terrified of the cancer returning. He insisted that I wanted a radical total removal of the gland, a procedure that carried significantly higher risks of complications, including severe bleeding and cardiac stress during anesthesia. He had pushed for this most dangerous surgical option available, and he had scheduled it as quickly as humanly possible. I sat there in the silence of the room, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his evil. Trent did not want a divorce. A divorce meant splitting assets. A divorce meant lawyers digging into his finances and uncovering his massive embezzlement scheme. A divorce meant he would have to pay alimony to a sick wife. He wanted me dead. If I died on that operating table, all his problems would instantly disappear. The massive real estate fraud he was committing would be covered up by an influx of $3 million in untaxable life insurance money. He could pay back the stolen earnest funds before anyone noticed they were missing. He would keep the $150,000 he stole from my home equity. He would play the role of the devastated, grieving widower for his family and the community. And then he would pack his bags, fly to Italy, and start a new lavish life with Chloe. But what about the text message, I thought? Why send me a text message demanding a divorce just 10 minutes before they put me under anesthesia? If he wanted me to die and collect the money, why create a record of a broken marriage? I opened a new tab on my browser and typed a few legal questions into the search bar. Within minutes, the chilling sociopathic logic of his plan became perfectly clear. It was an insurance strategy. It was a legal shield. Trent knew that if a relatively young woman unexpectedly dies during a standard surgery and her husband immediately claims a newly upgraded $3 million life insurance policy, the insurance company will launch an exhaustive investigation. They will look into everything. They will scrutinize his finances. They will look for any sign of foul play, extreme stress, or marital discord that might indicate he had a hand in her demise. By sending me that text message 10 minutes before my surgery, Trent was intentionally establishing a documented trail of estrangement. He was creating an alibi. If the insurance investigators came knocking, asking why he was not at the hospital with me, he would simply show them his phone. He would put on a sad face and tell them the tragic truth. He would say our marriage had been falling apart for months. He would say he asked for a divorce that very morning because he could not handle the emotional toll anymore. He would claim we were legally separating. Estranged husbands do not usually murder their wives if they are already walking away. The text message was his brilliant defense mechanism. It was designed to completely derail any suspicion of foul play. It was the perfect crime. He would induce a massive panic attack in his sick wife right before she went under heavy anesthesia, significantly increasing the chances of a fatal cardiac event on the table, while simultaneously building a solid legal defense for the inevitable insurance inquiry. I pushed the laptop away from me. I felt physically ill. The man I had loved, the man I had sacrificed 5 years of my youth for, had carefully and meticulously planned my execution. He had priced my life at exactly $3 million. I walked into the small, dingy bathroom of the rental apartment. I gripped the edges of the porcelain sink and stared at my reflection in the mirror. My face was pale. The thick white bandages wrapped around my throat looked stark and violent against my skin. I looked like a victim. I looked exactly like the broken, discarded woman Trent needed me to be. I reached up and touched the edge of the medical tape. The doctors had saved my life in that operating room, but now I had to save myself. I turned on the cold water faucet and splashed my face. The icy shock washed away the last lingering remnants of the naive, trusting wife I used to be. The grief was completely gone. The sadness had burned away, leaving behind a cold, forged steel. I walked back into the living room and picked up my phone. I dialed the number for Chloe. She answered on the first ring, her voice tight with anxiety. I found it. I told her, my voice rough but perfectly steady. I found everything. The stolen equity, the embezzled real estate funds, and the life insurance policy. He planned to kill me, Chloe. He planned to let me die so he could pay for your wedding. I could hear her sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Clara, what are we going to do? We need to call the police. We need to tell them right now." "No," I said. My tone was absolute. "If we call the police now, he runs. He hires the best defense attorneys in the city with my money. He hides the offshore accounts. He spins a story about how his crazy, sick wife and his jealous girlfriend fabricated a conspiracy against him. We do not go to the police yet. We go to a shark. We get everything airtight, and we trap him in a room he cannot lie his way out of." I hung up the phone. I looked around the miserable little apartment I had rented to play the victim. I was not going to be a victim for one more second. I gathered all my printed evidence, my flash drives, and my financial transcripts. I packed them into a heavy leather briefcase. I was going to find the most ruthless, aggressive attorney in the city, and I was going to hand him the keys to Trent's absolute destruction. Have you ever uncovered a lie so deep it felt like a movie? Drop a yes or no below, And make sure you are subscribed because what I did next shocked everyone. What time is it where you are right now? I walked into the law offices of Sterling and Associates on a dreary Tuesday morning. The physical toll of my thyroid surgery was still incredibly heavy. My neck throbbed with a dull and persistent ache, and my energy levels were dangerously low, but my mind was sharper than a razor. The law firm was located in a high-rise building in downtown Seattle. It was a place designed to intimidate. The lobby was all polished marble, dark mahogany paneling, and massive glass walls that looked out over the gray waters of Puget Sound. It was not the kind of place a working-class bookkeeper usually visited. It was the kind of place where wealthy people went to destroy each other. That was exactly why I was there. I was escorted into a massive corner conference room to meet with Mr. Sterling. He was a veteran estate and divorce attorney with a reputation for being absolutely ruthless. He was a man in his late 60s with silver hair, a perfectly tailored navy suit, and sharp blue eyes that looked like they could cut through solid steel. He did not offer warm platitudes or fake sympathy about my cancer diagnosis. He simply shook my hand, offered me a seat at the long wooden table, and asked me why I had requested an emergency consultation. I opened my heavy leather briefcase. I did not cry. I did not shake. I did not act like a terrified wife whose husband had just discarded her. I acted like a chief financial officer presenting a quarterly audit. I pulled out the first folder and slid it across the polished mahogany table. I told him this was the deed of trust for my home. I explained that I bought the house before I was married, but I had added my husband Trent to the deed 5 years ago. I pointed to the newly approved home equity line of credit for $150,000. I told Mr. Sterling that the signature on that document was a masterfully executed forgery and the notary public stamp was fraudulent. Mr. Sterling leaned forward, his sharp blue eyes narrowing as he inspected the document. He did not say a word, so I pulled out the second folder. I told him this was a record of commercial real estate transactions in the Bellevue Tech District. I explained that Trent had been embezzling earnest money from his real estate clients to fund private holding companies and offshore trusts. I laid out the financial flowcharts I had meticulously built over the past 48 hours, tracking the stolen escrow funds directly into Trent's hidden corporate accounts. I showed him how Trent used the stolen equity from my house to float his massive Ponzi scheme. Mr. Sterling took off his reading glasses. He looked from the documents to my face, his expression shifting from professional curiosity to absolute shock. I was not finished. I pulled out the third folder. This was the one that made my blood run cold every time I looked at it. I slid the 70-page life insurance policy across the table. I tapped my finger on the summary of benefits page. I told the ruthless attorney that exactly 2 weeks after I was diagnosed with thyroid cancer, my husband forged my electronic signature on a medical questionnaire and tripled my life insurance policy to a $3 million payout. I explained how Trent had bullied my primary care physician and aggressively pushed for a high-risk surgical procedure, moving the date up by 3 weeks. Finally, I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a small silver USB flash drive. I placed it gently in the center of the table. I told Mr. Sterling that this drive contained a crystal-clear audio recording of Trent sitting in an expensive seafood restaurant drinking rare wine with his secret fiancé. I explained that on this recording, Trent proudly brags about bribing a corrupt notary public with $5,000 in cash to stamp the forged loan documents. I added that the drive also contained a recording of Trent's sister Sarah visiting my hospital room to verbally abuse me, during which she accidentally detailed the exact locations of Trent's hidden commercial real estate empire. Mr. Sterling sat back in his heavy leather chair. The silence in the massive conference room was absolute. For a long time, the only sound was the rain beating against the floor-to-ceiling windows. He looked at the neatly organized stacks of paper, the financial flowcharts, the insurance policy, and the silver flash drive. He let out a low, slow breath. He told me he had been practicing family and estate law for 35 years. He had seen spouses hide money in secret bank accounts. He had seen husbands drain retirement funds to buy sports cars for their mistresses. He had seen bitter custody battles and petty arguments over antique furniture. But he looked me dead in the eye and said he had never in his entire career seen a domestic fraud case of this staggering magnitude documented with such terrifying precision. "You did not just bring me a divorce case, Clara," he said, his voice quiet and filled with deep respect. "You brought me a federal indictment wrapped in a bow. Your husband thought he was marrying a naive pushover. He did not realize he was marrying a forensic auditor. I told him I wanted everything. I wanted my house secured. I wanted my stolen money returned. But more importantly, I wanted Trent locked in a room where he could not lie his way out. I wanted him to face the absolute destruction of his carefully crafted false reality." Mr. Sterling smiled. It was the cold, predatory smile of a shark that had just smelled blood in the water. He told me that if we went to the police right now, Trent would hire a team of aggressive defense lawyers. He would try to stall the process, hide the assets, and drag me through years of grueling litigation while my body was still trying to recover from cancer. We needed to be smarter than that. We needed to let Trent believe his plan was working perfectly. We needed to let him feel so victorious, so invincible, that he would willingly walk right into a trap. 2 days later, the trap presented itself. I was sitting in my depressing, cheap rental apartment, resting an ice pack against my swollen neck when a loud knock echoed through the thin walls. I opened the door to find a man in a rumpled windbreaker holding a thick manila envelope. He asked if I was Clara Sterling. When I nodded, he shoved the envelope into my hands, muttered that I had been served, and quickly walked away down the dirty hallway. I carried the heavy envelope to my small kitchen table. My hands were perfectly steady as I tore open the seal and pulled out the legal documents. It was the official petition for the dissolution of our marriage filed by Trent's expensive downtown law firm. Reading through the demands was like reading a masterclass in sociopathic entitlement. Trent was not just asking for a divorce. He was asking for total financial annihilation. The petition claimed that our marriage had suffered an irretrievable breakdown due to my unreasonable behavior and alleged financial irresponsibility. He officially requested full ownership of the house I had purchased before we even met. His lawyers argued that the house was a marital asset and that Trent required the property to settle the massive debts he had heroically incurred while paying for my medical treatments. He wanted to strip me of my only true asset under the guise of paying for the cancer care he had actively used to try and kill me. In exchange for me signing over the deed to the house, waiving my right to spousal support, and accepting all of the remaining marital debt, Trent was generously offering me a lump sum settlement of exactly $10,000. $10,000. He had stolen $150,000 from my home equity. He was hiding millions of dollars in commercial real estate funded by embezzled client money. He had tried to collect $3 million on my life, and he thought he could buy my total silence and my absolute surrender for $10,000. A brief, blinding flash of pure rage washed over me. I wanted to tear the papers to shreds. I wanted to drive to his luxury real estate office and throw the ripped pages right in his arrogant face. But I took a deep breath, forcing the anger down into the cold, quiet place where my strategy lived. Mr. Sterling had told me to wait for Trent to make his move. This was his move. Now it was time to set the hook. I picked up my cell phone and dialed Trent's number. I waited as it rang once, twice, 3 times. I knew he was probably screening my call, wondering if he should answer. I cleared my throat intentionally, aggravating the fresh surgical incision on my neck so my voice would naturally crack. When he finally answered, his tone was incredibly clipped and professional, like he was speaking to a bothersome telemarketer. "Hello, Clara. I told you I needed space. I really think all communication should go through my attorney from now on." I let out a shaky, painful gasp. I made sure he could hear how much effort it took just to breathe. "Trent," I whispered, my voice incredibly raspy and weak. "Trent, please, I just got the papers." I heard a slight shift in the background noise on his end. He was paying attention now. "I know it seems harsh, Clara," he said, adopting his fake sympathetic voice, "but it is the only fair way to settle the debts. I have to protect my credit. I have to rebuild my life after everything this marriage has put me through. $10,000 is more than generous given your current financial state." I forced myself to start crying. Real tears actually sprang to my eyes because the pain in my throat was agonizing, making my performance entirely convincing. "I am just so tired, Trent," I sobbed quietly into the phone receiver. "I am so sick. The doctors say my recovery is going to take months. I do not have the energy to fight you. I do not have the money for a lawyer. I just want this nightmare to be over." There was a long pause on the line. I could practically hear the wheels turning in his narcissistic brain. He was evaluating my weakness. He was savoring his absolute victory. "I will sign the papers," I whispered, letting my voice break on the last word. "I will give you the house. I will take the $10,000. I just need to move on so I can heal in peace. But please, Trent, I cannot handle a long, drawn-out court battle. Can we just do a rapid mediation? Can we just sit down with a mediator, sign the final agreement, and be done with this completely?" Trent let out a heavy, dramatic sigh, playing the role of the exhausted but benevolent husband, granting his dying wife a final mercy. "Clara, I am a very busy man right now. My business is demanding all of my attention. But if you are truly willing to sign the quitclaim deed for the house and accept the $10,000 settlement without a fight, I will have my lawyer schedule an emergency mediation session for this Friday." "Thank you," I whimpered, making myself sound incredibly pathetic. "Thank you, Trent." He actually chuckled. It was a soft, incredibly cruel sound. "You are doing the right thing, Clara. This is for the best. You need to focus on your health, whatever is left of it. I will even pray for your recovery. Take care of yourself." He ended the call. The dial tone echoed in my quiet, depressing apartment. I pulled the phone away from my ear and wiped the tears from my face. My breathing slowed down and returned to normal. The weak, defeated, dying woman he thought he had just spoken to completely vanished. In her place sat a forensic bookkeeper who had just successfully lured a predator into an inescapable cage. Trent was incredibly arrogant. He truly believed he was the smartest person in any room. He believed that his charm, his tailored suits, and his aggressive manipulation could conquer any obstacle. He thought he had completely broken me. He thought I was just a naive, sick woman who was surrendering her most valuable asset simply because she was too exhausted to fight back. He thought he was walking into a routine mediation session to collect my signature, finalize his theft, and walk away a wealthy, unburdened man ready to marry his new beautiful bride. He had absolutely no idea that while he was busy planning his Italian wedding, I had spent the last 3 days coordinating with a ruthless legal shark. He had no idea that I possessed full audio confessions of his felonies. He had no idea that Chloe, the woman he thought he was protecting his stolen wealth for, was working directly with me. Trent took the bait perfectly. His massive ego blinded him to the reality of the situation. He was absolutely certain he had won. He thought Friday would be the day he finally destroyed my life for good. He did not know he was walking right into a slaughterhouse, and I was the one holding the blade. The morning of the mediation arrived with a heavy downpour that washed the streets of Seattle in sheets of gray water. I woke up long before my alarm was scheduled to go off. I lay perfectly still in the sagging bed of my cheap rental apartment, listening to the rain hitting the glass of the window. The burning throb in my neck was still there, acting as a constant reminder of the cancer surgery I had survived a few days ago. But the paralyzing fear and despair that used to accompany that pain were now completely gone. In their place was a sharp, cold focus. Today was Friday. Today was the day Trent thought he was going to walk into a legal room, collect my signature on a quitclaim deed, and walk away a wealthy man. I pushed the heavy thrift store blankets aside and stood up on the cold linoleum floor. I walked into the tiny bathroom and flipped on the harsh fluorescent overhead light. I stared at my reflection in the stained mirror for a long time. The woman looking back at me was pale and exhausted, but her dark eyes were clear and steady. I reached up and gently touched the edges of the fresh bandages wrapped tightly around my throat. Trent thought this wound made me weak. He genuinely believed it made me a helpless victim who would just surrender everything I had worked for. He had no idea that this injury was actually the catalyst that finally woke me up from a 5-year nightmare of gaslighting and financial abuse. I walked into the small kitchen and made a pot of strong black coffee. I sat down at the wobbly table, wrapped my hands around the warm mug, and pulled my cell phone out of my pocket. I needed to synchronize the final crucial details of the plan with Chloe. She was my inside woman, and her specific role today was essential to the trap we had built. I sent her a quick, secure message asking if she was ready for the morning. She replied seconds later, telling me she was wide awake, pacing her apartment and eagerly waiting for my signal. We went over our constructed timeline one last time to ensure there were zero mistakes. Trent's mediation appointment with me and my lawyer was scheduled for exactly 10 o'clock in the morning at the downtown offices of Sterling and Associates. He completely expected it to be a rapid surrender. He thought he would be in and out of the building in less than an hour, holding the deed to my house and leaving me with a $10,000 check. I told Chloe she needed to text his personal phone at exactly 9:30. She needed to catch him right as he was driving downtown, feeling incredibly arrogant and victorious about his master plan. I instructed her to tell him she was heading out to the luxury wedding venue to finalize the catering menu and the floral arrangements for their lavish Italian destination ceremony. More importantly, she needed to tell him that the venue coordinator required a massive non-refundable deposit today to secure the date. She had to demand that he wire the $150,000 from their joint wedding fund immediately after his meeting with me concluded. She had to make her text message sound incredibly urgent, but also highly adoring and exciting. I knew exactly how Trent's mind worked after spending 5 years balancing his books and managing his chaotic life. He would be riding a massive high this morning, thinking he had just successfully stolen my house and secured his permanent financial freedom from his sick wife. He would desperately want to play the wealthy hero for his beautiful young fiancé. He would eagerly promise to initiate the massive wire transfer the absolute second he stepped out of the mediation room. By forcing him to make this promise over a text message, we were ensuring that his active intent to commit federal wire fraud was completely documented, recorded, and fresh on his mind, right as he walked into our trap. Chloe sent back a long message promising she would send the exact text at exactly 9:30 without fail. She told me to stay strong and reminded me that we were going to completely destroy his life together. I drank my bitter coffee and watched the rain continue to fall over the busy highway outside my window. The setup was completely locked in place and the bait was hovering right in front of his face. By 8:30, I was already sitting quietly in the passenger seat of an unmarked black town car driven by a private investigator who worked directly for my attorney, Mr. Sterling. We were heading slowly downtown through the heavy morning traffic. I watched the sleek, expensive cars passing by us on the slick, wet pavement. I knew Trent was likely in one of those exact cars driving his leased silver sedan, listening to a business podcast and congratulating himself on a perfectly executed plan. He probably thought about the miserable $10,000 settlement he was offering me and chuckled at how easily I had rolled over and accepted my own financial ruin. He was a man who truly believed he was entirely untouchable by the law or by morality. He believed he was the absolute smartest person in any room he walked into. But while Trent was stuck in the morning traffic admiring his own reflection in the rearview mirror, my attorney was already executing a devastating legal strike behind the scenes. Mr. Sterling was sitting in his massive corner office on a secure conference call that would permanently dismantle Trent's entire existence. On the other end of that secure line was the senior director of the fraud division at the major national bank where Trent had secured the forged home equity line of credit against my property. Sitting alongside the bank director on the call was a seasoned detective from the Major Financial Crimes Unit of the Seattle Police Department. Mr. Sterling had not wasted a single second after our initial consultation earlier in the week. He had spent the last 48 hours compiling the massive mountain of evidence I had meticulously gathered and verified. He packaged the forged deed of trust, the matching illegal routing numbers, the offshore holding company formation documents, and the audio recording of Trent laughing about bribing a corrupt notary public into one undeniable, highly organized legal file. As my town car navigated the slick, crowded downtown streets, Mr. Sterling was walking the federal and local authorities through the entire complex embezzlement scheme. He explained exactly how Trent was taking large sums of earnest money from his unsuspecting real estate clients and funneling it into private commercial properties hidden in the Bellevue Tech District. He laid out the exact timeline of the home equity fraud, showing the detective how Trent used my stolen money as a slush fund to keep his massive Ponzi scheme afloat while he waited for larger payouts. The bank director was absolutely horrified and embarrassed to see exactly how easily their strict security protocols had been completely bypassed by a corrupt local notary public holding a fake stamp. The police detective was quietly taking notes and actively preparing the necessary arrest warrants for multiple individuals. And then Mr. Sterling delivered the final crushing blow to the authorities on the call. He sent them the digital copy of the $3 million life insurance policy that Trent had fraudulently upgraded just 2 weeks after my cancer diagnosis. He explained in a cold voice that Trent had deliberately pushed my doctors for a high-risk surgery and then cruelly demanded a divorce mere minutes before I went under anesthesia in a calculated attempt to induce a fatal cardiac event on the operating table. The detective actually stopped taking notes and asked Mr. Sterling to repeat that last part just to be absolutely sure he heard it correctly. When the full malicious scope of Trent's master plan finally settled over the silent conference call, the entire atmosphere completely shifted. This was no longer just a standard case of white-collar financial fraud or a messy suburban divorce. This was a documented, premeditated attempt to orchestrate a medical death for a massive, unearned insurance payout. The authorities immediately assured Mr. Sterling that they were initiating an emergency freeze on all of Trent's known and hidden bank accounts, including the offshore trusts, the shell companies, and the joint wedding fund he currently shared with Chloe. They were dispatching uniformed officers to secure the corrupt notary public who had stamped the forged documents. The legal net was being cast incredibly wide and it was being pulled incredibly tight. Trent was driving downtown, singing along to the radio, thinking he was about to finalize a wonderfully simple divorce settlement. He had absolutely no idea that his entire hidden financial empire was currently being frozen, seized, and dismantled by federal and local authorities. He had no idea that the $150,000 he was eagerly planning to wire to Chloe later that morning was already permanently locked down in a federal fraud investigation vault. His entire life was over, and he had not even parked his car yet. The black town car pulled smoothly into the underground parking garage of the high-rise office building shortly after 9 o'clock. I stepped out into the cool, damp air of the concrete structure, taking a deep breath. For the last 4 days, I had been wearing oversized stained sweatpants, faded baggy t-shirts, and an expression of total miserable defeat. I had perfectly played the role of the sick, broken, helpless wife hiding in a depressing rental apartment, crying endlessly over the tragic loss of her marriage. But that weak, weeping woman was completely gone now. She had served her strategic purpose. I reached into the back seat of the town car and pulled out a heavy black garment bag. The private investigator escorted me up the private service elevator directly to the quiet executive suite of Sterling and Associates. I walked into a spacious private marble restroom near the main conference room and locked the heavy wooden door behind me. I stripped off the baggy, depressing clothes and threw them directly into the trash can. I unzipped the garment bag and pulled out the specific outfit I had carefully chosen for this exact moment. It was a beautifully tailored charcoal gray power suit. The thick fabric was incredibly sharp and structured, completely opposite to the soft, vulnerable hospital gowns I had been forced to wear all week. I slipped into the matching gray trousers and slowly buttoned the crisp white silk blouse. I slid my feet into a pair of sleek, polished black heels that made me stand 2 full inches taller. I walked over to the large, brightly lit mirror above the polished marble sink and stared at myself. My face was still slightly pale from the massive blood loss during surgery, but my eyes were dark and fiercely determined. I gently applied a smooth layer of expensive foundation to completely hide the dark, exhausted circles under my eyes. I put on a bold coat of dark red lipstick. Finally, I reached into my bag and pulled out a beautiful, flowing silk scarf my grandmother had given me many years ago. I carefully wrapped the soft patterned silk around my neck, tying it elegantly to conceal the thick medical bandages still covering my raw surgical incision. I did not want Trent to see a single tiny sign of my physical injury. I did not want him to look at me across a table and see a sick, weak woman recovering from a terrible cancer. I wanted him to walk into that room and see an absolute, impenetrable wall of strength. I stepped out of the restroom and walked down the long, thickly carpeted hallway toward the main conference room. My black heels clicked a steady, confident, and rhythmic beat against the polished hardwood floorboards. Mr. Sterling was waiting quietly for me near the heavy mahogany double doors of the boardroom. He had just successfully finished his massive conference call with the bank executives and the police department. He looked at me carefully, taking in the sharp gray suit, the red lipstick, and the elegant silk scarf covering my wounds. He gave me a single, deeply approving nod. He told me in a low voice that the accounts were all officially frozen and the authorities were on standby waiting for his signal. All we had to do now was let Trent walk through the door and spring the trap. I walked into the massive corner conference room and took my seat at the far end of the long, highly polished mahogany table. The room was perfectly silent except for the faint, muffled sound of the city traffic moving far below the massive glass windows. I placed my hands flat on the cool, smooth wooden surface. I did not feel scared. I did not feel anxious. I felt an incredible, overwhelming sense of pure calm wash over me. It was the kind of deep, settling calm that only comes when you know with absolute certainty that justice is finally about to be served on a silver platter. I looked up at the large digital clock mounted on the far wall. It was exactly 9:45. Trent would be arriving in exactly 15 minutes. He would be strutting through those double doors, expecting to see a weeping, fragile, pathetic woman ready to sign her entire life away for $10 miserable thousand. He would be expecting to hand me a cheap pen and eagerly watch me surrender my house, my money, and my total dignity. I sat there in the quiet, beautiful room, perfectly still, and simply waited for the absolute monster to finally walk in. The heavy double doors of the conference room swung open at exactly 10 o'clock. Trent walked in. He did not look like a man whose wife had just survived a major cancer surgery. He looked like a man walking into a victory party. He was wearing a custom-tailored navy blue suit that I had paid for. His hair was perfectly styled. His expensive leather shoes clicked loudly against the polished hardwood floor. He radiated an overwhelming aura of absolute blinding arrogance. He truly believed he was the smartest person in the entire building. But Trent did not come alone. Walking closely behind him was his older sister, Sarah. She was 36 years old and lived in a massive house in the wealthy suburbs. She wore a pristine beige designer trench coat and carried a luxury handbag that cost more than my first car. Sarah had always despised me. She looked down on my working-class background. She thought my career as a professional bookkeeper was painfully beneath her family. She had come to my hospital room just days ago to viciously mock me while I lay bleeding and recovering from surgery. Now she was here for moral support. She wanted a front row seat to watch the working class trash get officially discarded. She took a seat next to Trent and shot me a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. She was eager to watch me sign my entire life away. I sat perfectly still at the far end of the massive mahogany conference table. The room inside the law offices of Sterling & Associates was quiet, insulated from the loud, bustling streets of downtown Seattle. The thick glass windows offered a sprawling view of the gray, stormy skyline. The rain hit the glass in steady, rhythmic drops. I was wearing a sharp, tailored charcoal gray suit. The heavy fabric felt like a suit of armor protecting me from the world. A beautiful silk scarf was wrapped securely around my neck, completely hiding the thick white medical bandages that covered my fresh surgical incision. I did not want Trent to see my wounds. I did not want him to see a sick, weak wife recovering from a brutal thyroid cancer surgery. I wanted him to see an impenetrable wall of cold, hard facts. Mr. Sterling sat quietly to my right. He was the most ruthless estate and divorce attorney in the city. His hands rested flat on top of a thick leather binder. Inside that binder was the complete destruction of Trent's life. We had arrived 30 minutes early to prepare for this exact moment. The mediator, a polite and professional older woman named Helen, sat at the head of the table. She was organizing her legal pads and clicking her pen. She had handled thousands of divorce cases in her long career. She thought she understood exactly what was going to happen today. She thought she was here to gently guide a broken, devastated woman through the painful process of surrendering her marital assets to an exhausted husband. She looked at me with a soft, sympathetic expression that made my stomach churn. She had absolutely no idea that she was about to witness a financial execution. Trent did not even bother to look me in the eye. He pulled out his heavy leather chair and sat down with a dramatic, weary sigh. He immediately began his performance for the mediator. He looked at Helen and offered a sad, exhausted smile. He thanked her for making time for this emergency mediation session. He claimed that the emotional toll of my illness and my incredibly difficult personality had simply been too much for him to bear. He actually managed to make his voice sound thick with manufactured grief. He explained to Helen that we just needed to finalize this separation immediately, so we could both begin to heal and move on with our lives. He painted himself as the long-suffering martyr who was heroically choosing to walk away rather than engage in a bitter court battle. Helen offered him a warm, understanding nod, completely falling for his sociopathic charm. Trent reached into his slim leather briefcase. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents and slid them confidently across the smooth mahogany table until they rested directly in front of me. He placed an expensive silver pen right on top of the pages. I looked down at the documents. On the very top of the stack was a quitclaim deed. It was a legal document completely surrendering my ownership of the house I had purchased with my own money years before I ever met him, the house I had worked double shifts to save for. Next to the deed was a certified cashier's check for exactly $10,000. He was offering me $10,000 to walk away from my home, my life savings, and my dignity. "Just sign it, Clara," Trent said softly. His tone was dripping with fake compassion, but his eyes were completely cold and dead. "Do not make this harder than it is. We both know this is the best way forward. Take the money and focus on your recovery. Let us just end this peacefully." Sarah leaned forward across the table, resting her manicured hands on the polished wood. She added that $10,000 was incredibly generous considering the massive medical debts Trent was taking on. She told me I should be incredibly grateful he was not leaving me completely destitute. She said I needed to sign the papers right now so her brother could finally find some peace. I did not reach for the silver pen. I did not touch the legal documents. I simply sat there, breathing slowly and evenly, letting the absolute silence in the room stretch out. The seconds ticked by heavily. The soft rain outside seemed to echo in the quiet space. The smug, confident smile on Trent's face began to tighten slightly at the corners. He shifted his weight in his chair. He tapped his finger impatiently against the edge of the table. He expected me to cry. He expected me to beg. He expected me to sign the papers with a trembling hand and run away. I looked up slowly and met his gaze directly. I let the silence hold for another 5 seconds. Then I spoke. My voice was raspy from the surgery, but it was perfectly clear and completely devoid of any emotion. I asked him why I should sign away the deed to my house when there was a massive recorded lien against the property. I kept my posture relaxed. I asked him what exactly he wanted me to do about the $150,000 home equity line of credit that was quietly taken out against the property exactly 3 weeks ago. The color instantly drained from Trent's face. He looked like a man who had just been struck by lightning. His hand stopped tapping against the table. The heavy, confident posture completely collapsed. Helen, the mediator, looked up sharply from her notes, her brow furrowing in deep confusion. She looked from Trent back to me, trying to understand the sudden shift in the atmosphere. Sarah let out an impatient scoff and asked what on earth I was talking about. She crossed her arms and glared at me, telling me to stop making up ridiculous lies to stall the mediation. Trent swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed heavily against his crisp white collar. He tried to force a dismissive laugh, but it came out sounding like a dry, choking cough. He turned quickly to Helen. He told her that I was clearly confused. He claimed I did not understand our complex household finances, and that there was absolutely no home equity line of credit on the house. He tried to project his usual arrogant confidence, but his voice cracked slightly on the last word. I did not raise my voice. I did not let him interrupt me. I simply asked my next question. I asked him about the earnest money from the Miller commercial property. I asked him why exactly $300,000 of client escrow funds had been illegally transferred from his real estate brokerage's secure trust account into a private limited liability company registered in Delaware. I listed the exact bank routing numbers from memory. I listed the exact dates of the wire transfers. I asked him how many commercial lots in the Bellevue Tech District he had purchased using stolen client money. I asked him if his new beautiful fiancée Chloe was aware that her lavish Italian destination wedding was being entirely funded by federal wire fraud and blatant embezzlement. Trent's polished, immaculate facade completely shattered into a million jagged pieces. The transformation was instantaneous and utterly terrifying to witness. The suave, confident businessman evaporated into thin air. In his place sat a desperate, frantic, cornered animal. Thick beads of sweat began to form on his forehead. His eyes darted wildly around the conference room, looking for an exit that did not exist. His breathing became shallow and rapid. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Sarah turned to look at her brother, her face twisting into a mask of pure, total confusion. She had known about the secret real estate empire because he had proudly bragged about it to her. She thought he was a brilliant, successful investor making massive moves in the commercial market. She had absolutely no idea that he had built that entire empire by embezzling money from innocent families and defrauding his own clients. She stared at Trent's sweating, pale face. She demanded to know what I was talking about. She asked him why I knew about the Bellevue properties and the offshore holding companies. She asked him why he was not denying the accusations. Trent completely ignored his sister. He slammed his hand flat against the heavy mahogany table, producing a loud, echoing crack. He pointed a violently shaking finger directly at my face. He turned frantically to Helen, the mediator. He raised his voice, shouting that this entire mediation was a massive mistake. He told the mediator that I was completely insane. He claimed with desperate, frantic energy that the heavy anesthesia from my cancer surgery had completely destroyed my mind. He yelled that I was suffering from severe post-surgery delusions and massive paranoia. He tried to spin a wild, desperate narrative right there in the middle of the room. He shouted that the intense emotional stress of our impending divorce had caused me to suffer a total psychotic break. He claimed I was inventing wild, paranoid fantasies about his real estate business simply to punish him for deciding to leave me. He demanded that the mediator completely ignore every single word I was saying because I was a deeply sick, mentally unstable woman who belonged in a locked psychiatric ward. He was screaming now, the veins popping out on his neck, his face red with manic desperation. He looked like a madman trying to escape a burning building. I sat perfectly still while he screamed. I did not flinch. I let him yell and point and sweat. I watched the frantic, desperate performance of a man who realized his entire existence was slipping through his fingers. When he finally paused to take a ragged breath, I calmly reached into the inside pocket of my blazer. I pulled out a single sheet of paper and placed it quietly on the table. It was a high-resolution printed copy of the forged home equity loan agreement. I tapped my finger gently against the forged signature at the bottom of the page. I asked him if his post-surgery delusion theory also applied to the corrupt notary public he had bribed with $5,000 in cash. I asked him if his new fiancée Chloe was also suffering from a psychotic break when she secretly recorded him bragging about forging my name on this exact document during their expensive seafood dinner 3 nights ago. Trent stared at the document on the table. His mouth hung open. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. He slowly realized that Chloe, the woman he thought was his eager, naive partner in his new, wealthy life, was the one who had handed me the final piece of evidence. He realized that the trap was perfectly designed. He realized that the sister he brought for moral support had been the one to give me the map to his hidden assets. He realized that the quiet working-class bookkeeper he had constantly mocked and underestimated had systematically dismantled his entire life without making a single sound. Sarah was staring at the forged signature on the table, her eyes wide with mounting horror. She looked at Trent and asked him if it was true. She asked him if he had actually stolen money from a sick woman to pay for a wedding with a mistress. Trent could not answer her. He could only stare at me, his chest heaving, his perfectly styled hair now sticking to his damp forehead. He was drowning in his own lies, and the water was rising incredibly fast. He turned back to the mediator, his voice dropping to a frantic, pleading whisper. He begged her to stop the session. He said he needed his own legal counsel. He repeated over and over again that I was a crazy, delusional woman making up insane stories to ruin him. He told Helen she was witnessing a mental breakdown and that none of my documents were real. He was literally begging a complete stranger to believe his gaslighting because he had absolutely nothing else left to use. He was cornered, broken, and entirely out of options. Trent was still standing in the middle of the conference room, hyperventilating and begging the mediator to believe his frantic lies. He was sweating completely through his expensive tailored suit. He was painting me as a delusional woman driven mad by cancer surgery and desperate for revenge. Helen, the mediator, looked completely paralyzed, not knowing how to handle a man who was unraveling so violently right in front of her. Sarah sat frozen in her heavy leather chair with her manicured hands clutching her designer handbag. The air in the conference room was thick and incredibly heavy. Trent took another ragged breath and slammed his hand on the mahogany table again, demanding that my attorney, Mr. Sterling, throw the forged documents in the trash immediately. He yelled that he was a highly respected real estate broker and no one in the world would ever believe a crazy sick woman over him. Right at that exact second, the heavy mahogany double doors of the conference room swung open. The sound was loud enough to make Trent physically jump out of his skin. Every single head in the room turned toward the doorway. Standing there, perfectly framed by the dark wood of the door frame, was Chloe. She looked absolutely radiant and undeniably furious. She was wearing a sleek, professional black dress, and her posture was completely rigid with cold determination. But the most important detail was resting clearly on her left hand. She had made sure to wear the massive, sparkling diamond engagement ring Trent had bought for her, using the exact money he stole from my home equity line of credit. The heavy diamond caught the overhead fluorescent lights and sent tiny bright refractions of light dancing across the polished surface of the conference table. Trent stopped talking instantly. The frantic, desperate words died right in his throat. I watched the very last trace of color drain completely out of his face, leaving him looking like a hollow, chalk-white ghost. His eyes bulged out of his head as he stared at the woman he thought he had perfectly compartmentalized in another distant part of his life. He literally stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the large leather chair behind him and grasping the armrest just to keep his balance. Chloe stepped into the room and let the heavy doors click shut behind her. The sound echoed in the quiet space like a heavy judge gavel dropping in a silent courtroom. She did not look at me. She did not look at Mr. Sterling or the stunned mediator. She kept her eyes entirely fixed on Trent. She walked slowly and deliberately around the long table, closing the physical distance between them. Trent raised a trembling hand as if he could somehow physically push her away. He tried to speak, but only a pathetic squeaking sound escaped his lips. He was completely trapped. The two distinct realities he had built, his devoted sick wife and his naive, wealthy future bride, had just violently collided in a single room. Sarah looked from her brother to the beautiful young woman walking toward them, her brow furrowed in total absolute confusion. She had never seen Chloe before in her entire life. Trent had kept his secret life completely hidden from his family, knowing that any tiny slip-up could expose his massive financial fraud. Sarah demanded to know who this strange woman was and why she was interrupting a private legal mediation session. She looked at Chloe with the same judgmental, haughty glare she usually reserved for me whenever I attended their miserable family holidays. Chloe completely ignored Sarah's nasty tone. She reached into her sleek black purse and pulled out a small silver flash drive alongside a thick stack of printed paper transcripts. She tossed them carelessly onto the center of the mahogany table right next to the forged home equity loan agreement I had placed there moments before. Then Chloe finally turned to look directly at Trent's sister. Her Her voice was incredibly calm, but it carried a sharp, icy edge that cut right through the suffocating tension in the room. "He is not a grieving widower," Sarah Chloe said, keeping her eyes locked on the older woman, "and he is certainly not an honest businessman either." Sarah let out a sharp, audible gasp. She looked at Trent, and then back to Chloe, completely disoriented by the statement. "A widower," she repeated, her voice trembling slightly as her mind tried to process the information. She stated that her brother was not a widower and that his wife was sitting right there at the end of the table. Chloe gave a slow, humorless nod. "I know she is," she replied calmly. "But for the past 12 months, Trent has been telling me a very different story. He told me he was trapped in a tragic situation. He told me his wife was battling terminal stage 4 cancer and had only weeks left to live. He painted himself as a devoted, suffering husband waiting patiently by her bedside while she slowly faded away. He told me he was finding his strength in me. He proposed to me 2 months ago and promised me a lavish destination wedding in Italy the absolute second his wife finally passed away." Helen, the mediator, actually dropped her pen. It clattered loudly onto the polished wood and rolled onto the floor. She stared at Trent with a look of pure, unfiltered disgust. I sat silently at my end of the table, letting the beautiful reality of the truth do all the heavy lifting. I watched Sarah process the words. I watched her mind struggle to comprehend the sheer scale of her brother's terrifying deception. She had firmly believed Trent was the ultimate victim. She had believed I was draining his savings and making his life totally miserable. Now she was staring at a woman wearing her brother's engagement ring, a woman who had been eagerly waiting for me to die. Trent finally found his voice. It was a weak, desperate, pitiful whimper. "Chloe, please," he begged, taking a small step toward her with his hands clasped together. "Please, you do not understand what is happening here. She is lying to you. Clara set this entire thing up. Clara is just trying to ruin us because she is jealous. You cannot believe anything she says. We are supposed to be together, Chloe. We are supposed to be building a future in Europe." Chloe looked at him with absolute total revulsion. She took a step back, holding her hand up to stop him from coming any closer to her. She told him never to speak to her again. She told him that she knew exactly where the $150,000 in their joint wedding account came from. She pointed sharply to the forged document resting on the table and declared that he had stolen it from a sick woman who spent 5 years working double shifts to pay off his massive debts. She told him he was a disgusting, cowardly predator who built his entire pathetic existence on a foundation of cruel lies and stolen money. Trent turned to his sister, his eyes wild and completely unhinged by the confrontation. "Sarah, you have to help me," he pleaded desperately. "You have to tell them I would never do this to anyone. You know me, Sarah. You know I am a good man. I am building a massive real estate empire for our family." But Sarah was no longer looking at him with sisterly devotion or blind loyalty. She was looking at him like he was a complete stranger who had just broken into her house. She asked him if it was true. Her voice was barely a trembling whisper. She asked him if he had actually forged my name and stolen the equity from my home. She asked him if the commercial properties in Bellevue were truly bought with stolen client money, just like I had claimed earlier. She demanded that he look her directly in the eye and tell her the absolute truth. Before Trent could formulate another desperate lie, Mr. Sterling took complete control of the entire room. He leaned forward quietly and picked up the small silver flash drive Chloe had thrown onto the table. He plugged it directly into a small black speaker system sitting in the center of the conference table. He did not ask for permission from the mediator. He did not care about the standard legal protocols of a routine mediation session. This was no longer a mediation at all. This was a completely orchestrated financial execution. Mr. Sterling pressed a single button on his laptop keyboard, and the clear, undeniable audio of Trent's own voice filled the quiet room. It was the secret recording from the expensive seafood restaurant. Everyone at the table sat in dead silence as the audio played loudly. We heard the sharp clinking of expensive wine glasses. We heard Chloe asking him how he got the money without me noticing a thing. And then we heard the arrogant, cruel laughter of a man who thought he was completely invincible and above the law. We heard Trent explicitly brag about how incredibly easy it was to drain my home equity. We heard him call me a naive, exhausted bookkeeper who was simply too stupid and tired to ever check her own property records. The entire room listened as he proudly confessed to bribing a corrupt notary public with $5,000 in cash to bypass the legal signature requirements. We heard him say I was so distracted by my terrifying cancer diagnosis that I would never even think to question the fake bank statements he had been meticulously printing out and leaving on my home office desk. The audio continued playing, highlighting his absolute sociopathic lack of empathy for human life. He laughed loudly about the divorce text he sent me right before my dangerous surgery. He explained to Chloe on the recording that it was a brilliant legal shield to establish estrangement just in case I died on the operating table. He bragged that if the insurance company asked questions about the massive $3 million life insurance payout he was planning to collect, his text message would prove he was already walking away and had no reason to harm me. Trent let out a loud guttural cry of pure panic as his own voice condemned him. He lunged violently across the heavy mahogany table, his hands frantically grabbing for the speaker and the laptop. He knocked over a large glass pitcher of water, sending it shattering into pieces onto the hardwood floor. He scrambled wildly, trying to pull the silver flash drive out of the machine, screaming at the top of his lungs that the recording was completely fake. He yelled that it was deep-faked audio created by artificial intelligence to frame an innocent man. He shouted that I had hired professional hackers to destroy his reputation. But his frantic, violent physical reaction only confirmed exactly what everyone in the room already knew deep down. It was completely real. Every single horrifying word of it was real. Mr. Sterling calmly pulled the laptop out of his reach, sliding it safely to the other end of the table. He looked at Trent with absolute zero emotion on his weathered face. He told Trent to sit down immediately and be quiet before he called the building security team to have him physically restrained and removed. He informed Trent in a cold, steady voice that digital copies of this exact audio file, along with the forged deeds and the offshore trust formation documents, had already been delivered to the Financial Crimes Division of the Seattle Police Department an hour ago. He told him that his personal and business bank accounts were currently frozen solid and his corrupt notary friend was likely already sitting in a police interrogation room. Sarah pushed her heavy leather chair back so violently it tipped over and crashed loudly onto the floor. She backed away from the table, her hands covering her mouth in sheer terror. The total horror on her face was almost difficult to look at. She had idolized her successful younger brother for her entire life. She had treated me like absolute dirt for years because she believed Trent's narrative that I was simply not good enough for their wealthy, prestigious family. Now she was forced to realize that her beloved brother was a common criminal, a massive fraud, and a monster who was actively plotting to profit off his own wife's medical death. Trent turned to her, with heavy tears streaming down his flushed face. "Sarah, please," he begged, reaching his shaking hand out toward her. "You are my sister, and I need you. You have to help me get a good defense lawyer right now. I do not have any access to my money anymore. I need your financial help to fight this." Sarah continued to back away from him until her shoulders hit the cold glass wall of the conference room. She shook her head rapidly as tears spilled over her perfectly applied designer makeup. She told him to stay far away from her. She told him he was deeply sick and entirely evil, and she wanted absolutely nothing to do with him for the rest of her life. She looked directly at me, sitting quietly at the end of the table, wrapped in my sharp charcoal suit. For the very first time in 5 long years, her eyes did not hold a single ounce of disgust or superiority. They held deep, profound shame and endless apology. She realized she had been a willing pawn in his long, sick game of psychological abuse. She grabbed her expensive designer handbag and practically ran out of the conference room, leaving Trent completely and utterly alone to face his ruin. Trent fell heavily to his knees on the wet hardwood floor, right in the middle of the shattered glass from the broken water pitcher. The arrogant, confident real estate broker was entirely gone forever. The man who thought he could steal my life savings, gaslight his own family, and leave me to die alone was currently weeping pathetically on the ground. He looked up at me, his face a twisted, broken mask of total defeat. He asked me why I did this to him. He actually had the sheer massive audacity to look a cancer survivor in the eye and ask why I ruined his perfect life. I slowly stood up from my chair, smoothing the front of my jacket. I looked down at him, shivering on the floor. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of pity. I did not need to. I simply told him that I was just balancing the books. Trent was still on his knees in the center of the massive conference room. The shattered pieces of the glass water pitcher lay scattered completely around him, reflecting the harsh overhead fluorescent lights. He looked entirely and pitifully broken. His custom-tailored navy suit, the one I had worked double shifts to pay for, was wrinkled and completely damp with his own nervous sweat. The room was perfectly quiet. Mr. Sterling sat next to me with his hands folded neatly on the polished mahogany table, completely unbothered by the pathetic display of a ruined man. The mediator was pressed firmly back into her heavy leather chair, still clutching her yellow legal pad, her eyes wide with total shock. Chloe stood near the door, her posture rigid and her face completely devoid of any sympathy for the man who had lied to her for an entire year. I watched Trent struggle desperately to pull himself up from the wet floor. He grabbed the edge of the heavy wooden table, his knuckles turning totally white from the intense effort. He was muttering quietly under his breath, desperately trying to formulate one final lie, one ultimate manipulation that could somehow magically erase the massive mountain of undeniable evidence stacked right in front of him. But he never got the chance to speak another word. At exactly 10:15, the heavy double doors of the conference room swung open for the last and final time. Mr. Sterling had coordinated the exact timing perfectly with the local authorities. 2 uniformed Seattle police officers stepped into the room, followed closely by a plainclothes detective from the Major Financial Crimes Division. The officers looked incredibly professional and completely serious. Their heavy black boots thudded loudly against the polished hardwood floor, shattering whatever tiny, fragile shred of hope Trent still had left inside his narcissistic mind. The detective held a thick manila folder in his left hand. He looked directly at Trent and calmly asked him to confirm his legal identity. Trent completely froze. His eyes darted wildly from the uniformed officers to the detective and then back across the table to me. He tried to speak, but his vocal cords completely failed him. He managed to give a tiny, pathetic nod of his head. The detective did not waste a single precious second. He immediately informed Trent that he was placing him under arrest. The detective began listing the specific charges in a calm, steady voice that echoed endlessly through the quiet conference room. He stated clearly that Trent was being formally charged with felony forgery for intentionally falsifying a signature on a bank loan document. He listed federal wire fraud for moving stolen funds across state lines to a foreign wedding venue. He listed severe corporate embezzlement for stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars in earnest money from his unsuspecting real estate clients. And finally, the detective noted that there was an active ongoing investigation into massive insurance fraud regarding the recent suspicious changes to my life insurance policy. The harsh reality of the situation crashed down on Trent with the absolute devastating force of a runaway freight train. The arrogant, wealthy real estate broker, the man who honestly thought he could steal my life savings and massively profit off my medical death, was completely gone. In his place was a terrified, desperate coward facing the total destruction of his life. As one of the uniformed officers stepped forward and firmly grabbed his arm to turn him around, Trent completely lost his mind. He tried desperately to pull his arm away. He started thrashing wildly and begging. He looked at Mr. Sterling and shouted that this was a massive misunderstanding and a terrible mistake. He looked at Chloe and pleaded with her to tell the police that they were deeply in love and that the money was just a simple romantic gift. Chloe simply turned her head away in pure disgust and refused to even look at him. Then Trent turned his desperate, wild eyes toward me. He fell heavily back to his knees, completely ignoring the sharp pull of the police officer holding his arm. "Clara, please," he begged, his voice breaking into a loud, pathetic, echoing sob. "Clara, you have to stop this immediately. You are my wife. We promise to always take care of each other. Please tell them to stop right now. You cannot let them do this to me. I am so incredibly sorry. I will give all the money back tomorrow. I will cancel the divorce paperwork. We can fix this, Clara. Please do not do this to me." I sat perfectly still at the far end of the long mahogany table. I looked at the man who had systematically and cruelly tried to destroy every single aspect of my life. I thought deeply about the 5 long years I spent working double shifts as a professional bookkeeper just to pay off his massive business debts. I thought about the pure, blinding terror of my cancer diagnosis and how he had maliciously used my terminal illness as a weapon to orchestrate my death on an operating table. I thought about the incredible physical pain radiating in my throat from the dangerous surgery he had intentionally rushed. I did not feel a single solitary ounce of pity for him. I felt completely, entirely, and beautifully free. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on the cool, smooth wood of the table. I looked directly into his terrified, panic-stricken eyes. My voice was still raspy from the fresh surgical incision, but it was perfectly calm and absolutely unwavering. "I am just adapting, Trent," I said slowly and clearly, "like you always told me to." Trent opened his mouth to scream another desperate plea, but the police officer pulled his arms firmly and sharply behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs snapping tightly around his wrists echoed loudly through the entire conference room. It was the absolute most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire life. The officers pulled him roughly to his feet and began marching him toward the open door. Trent was crying openly now, sobbing like a terrified child as they led him out of the room and down the long, carpeted hallway toward the elevators. The heavy wooden doors clicked shut behind them, sealing his miserable fate permanently. Mr. Sterling closed his thick leather binder and gave me a quiet, deeply respectful nod. The trap had worked absolutely flawlessly. The monster was finally gone from my life. 6 months later, the dark, heavy emotional clouds over my life had completely cleared away. The dreary, gray Seattle winter had finally surrendered to a bright, beautiful, and warm summer. I was sitting comfortably on the front porch of my house, holding a warm cup of herbal tea and watching the bright morning sunlight filter through the green leaves of the large oak tree in my front yard. The house belonged entirely to me again without a single string attached. Mr. Sterling had absolutely decimated Trent's remaining legal defenses in record time. The bank entirely reversed the fraudulent home equity line of credit the exact moment the corrupt notary public confessed his crimes to the police in exchange for a significantly lighter sentence. My property deed was completely clear. My life savings were entirely secure and back in my own accounts. My physical recovery had been just as miraculous and complete as my financial victory. My surgical oncologist had recently sat me down in his bright, cheerful medical office and handed me a perfectly clean bill of health. The high-risk surgery, despite Trent's evil intentions, had been a complete medical success, and the invasive thyroid cancer was entirely gone from my body. The thick white medical bandages were long gone too. In their place was a thin, delicate silver scar curving gently across the lower front of my neck. I used to cover it constantly with elegant silk scarves because I was deeply self-conscious, but I do not hide it anymore. That scar is not a symbol of weakness or disease. It is a permanent physical badge of incredible honor. It proves to the world that I survived a deadly illness, and it proves that I survived a deadly manipulative man. Trent did not fare as well as I did. Once the aggressive federal investigators officially cracked open his private holding companies and his hidden offshore trusts, his entire criminal empire completely imploded on a spectacular scale. The financial evidence I had painstakingly gathered as a forensic bookkeeper was so incredibly overwhelming and totally undeniable that his expensive defense attorneys strongly advised him to completely surrender. He took a federal plea deal to avoid spending multiple decades behind bars, but the judge still handed down a severe multi-year prison sentence. Trent permanently traded his custom-tailored Navy suits and his expensive leather shoes for a standard-issue orange prison uniform. The State Real Estate Commission permanently revoked his broker's license, ensuring he could never defraud another family again. He was publicly disgraced, entirely bankrupt, and firmly locked in a federal penitentiary where his natural arrogance and his sociopathic charm meant absolutely nothing to the guards. He had lost his career, his freedom, and his future because he drastically underestimated the wrong woman. Later that afternoon, I drove my 10-year-old, completely reliable car downtown to a bright, busy coffee shop located right near the waterfront. I walked inside and immediately spotted Chloe sitting at a small, quiet table by the large glass window. She stood up and gave me a warm, completely genuine hug. She looked incredibly healthy and truly happy. Her knee surgery had healed perfectly, and she was no longer leaning heavily on medical crutches. The massive, sparkling diamond engagement ring was permanently gone from her left hand, replaced by a simple gold band she bought for herself. We ordered our warm coffee and sat down together, watching the large white ferry boats move slowly across the sparkling blue water of Puget Sound. We did not talk about Trent. He was no longer a relevant or interesting part of our lives. We talked about her exciting new promotion at her corporate marketing firm. We talked about my independent bookkeeping business, which was currently booming because my professional reputation for meticulous financial auditing had skyrocketed after the local news quietly caught wind of the massive embezzlement scandal. We were no longer two women cruelly pitted against each other by a manipulative, selfish predator. We were two strong, independent women who had survived a massive emotional storm and emerged completely victorious on the other side. We drank our coffee, laughed at a shared joke, and simply enjoyed the profound, incredible peace of a beautiful, ordinary day. When I finally drove back to my quiet suburban neighborhood and pulled into the driveway of my house, I felt a deep, overwhelming sense of pure gratitude. I walked confidently through the front door and looked around the cozy living room I had worked so incredibly hard to build and fiercely protect. The space was filled with bright, natural light and warmth and absolute safety. I had faced the absolute darkest, most terrifying chapter of my life, and I had not just survived, I had completely and totally triumphed. I had taken back every single thing that rightfully belonged to me, and I had burned his entire deceitful, fraudulent world to the ground, just like I promised myself I would when the heavy anesthesia pulled me under in that freezing hospital room. Setting boundaries is not cruel, it is survival. When someone shows you who they truly are, especially when you are at your absolute most vulnerable, you have to believe them immediately. You cannot let love or misguided loyalty blind you to the harsh reality of their actions. Predators thrive in the dark, and they count on your silence, your total exhaustion, and your willingness to constantly forgive their terrible behavior. But you do not owe anyone your life savings, your home, or your mental sanity just to keep the peace in a highly toxic relationship. Do not ever let anyone convince you that you are a burden. Do not let anyone tell you that you are too sick, too weak, or too broken to fight back for what is yours. You have an incredible, endless well of strength inside you that only fully reveals itself when you are pushed to the absolute edge. You are enough exactly as you are today. You do not need to shrink yourself to fit into someone else's selfish narrative, and you certainly do not need to apologize for fiercely protecting your own life and your own future. You have the total power to follow the paper trail, to carefully document the truth, and to stand up tall against the people who try to destroy you. Thank you for staying until the very end. If this story meant something to you, hit subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it. I will see you in the next story.